God of the Woods. This is a book about values, or a lack thereof. It's about the hypocrisy and shallow-minded hollowness of the wealthy elite. It's a book about growing, learning, agency, and misogyny in its various forms during the 1950s through 1970s in the United States of America. This video will cover the book's entire contents, so spoilers included, the implications, and various pieces of the gorgeous mural painted by Liz Moore in The God of the Woods. This book has 18 distinct points of view. I'm just kidding. It's more like 8, but it feels like 18. And 6 different points in time. The book opens in August of 1975. For context, if you type 1975 into Google, this is what it gives you. Culturally, it was the birth of the summer blockbuster Jaws, the premiere of Saturday Night Live, the founding of Microsoft, and the Thrilla in Manila boxing match. So it was different times. The news was discussing different things. Our setting is Camp Emerson, originally owned by Peter Van Laar the First. He's an outdoor enthusiast and devoted conservationist, dedicated to the learning of the land. He opened the camp. Now, Camp Emerson sits on acres of land, divided by the camp's attendees and attendants. The camp's attendants, the people that run the camp, typically come from the town of Shattuck, which is just a few miles away. And the children that attend the camp are almost exclusively children of powerful, wealthy elite. It's a very expensive camp, very hoity-toity, well-to-do. So the land is now split into Camp Emerson and Self-Reliance, the property that the Van Laar family still occupies every summer. We learn that the Van Laars tend to distinguish themselves pretty intentionally from the people of Shattuck or the people that work for them on the grounds of Self-Reliance or on the camp. To the townspeople of Shattuck, the camp represented a place of importance in their lives that they simultaneously resented and acknowledged. Following the closure of Shattuck's paper mill, the preserve, with its summer camp, functioned as a sort of industry unto itself. So, Camp Emerson is located on that same preserve, and it is now owned by Peter II, Peter Van Laar's son, who's now like 80 years old, and mostly operated by Peter Van Laar III, who's in his mid-40s, his wife Alice, and their daughter, when she's not at boarding school, Barbara, who's 13. The person who actually operates and runs the grounds, though, is Vic Hewitt. So it now essentially is a summer property for this very wealthy family. For many years, the Van Laars have hosted the Black Fly Goodbye, wherein they celebrate the departure of the black fly pests that have populated the Adirondacks, and they honor that departure by throwing a week-long celebration wherein they invite all sorts of people of important repute, inviting many relevant friends, networking connection, potential business opportunities, and of course, artists and celebrities to populate the place. They're sort of the week's entertainment. They host these folks for a week of field games that I think are required, cocktail hours, intense Scrabble matches, and general lake fun at the preserve. That being said, this tradition has not taken place for 14 years, not since the disappearance of the Van Laar's 8-year-old son, Bear, but we'll get there. This year, the summer of 1975, is the first time the tradition will resume in 14 years. Page 1 starts from the perspective of Louise, whom I love and would protect with my life. Louise is 23 years old, and she wakes up in August of 1975 to find one of the beds of her 12 campers empty. Louise is a camp counselor at Camp Emerson and has been for several years. She loves this job and considers Camp Emerson more home than almost anywhere else that she's ever lived in her entire life. She's a child that didn't necessarily have a childhood, that grew up really fast, that did everything right, and still didn't get where she wanted to go. Before we get more into Louise, I will tell you that the camper whose bed is empty, the camper who is missing, is Barbara Van Laar, daughter to Alice and Peter Van Laar, sister to the disappeared 8-year-old Bear 14 years prior. Louise tells us that the night before, she wasn't supposed to be out, but she was. It's her 3rd year at camp, she's close with the grounds director, she's a lead counselor, so she kind of has the run of the place. She has a set of rules that she feels comfortable with her counselors occasionally breaking, rules that she considers harmless, knowing that everyone is safe and everyone makes sure their responsibilities and duties get met. And last night, Louise wasn't on duty. Her counselor in training, CIT, Annabelle, the 17-year-old, was supposed to be on duty. In her recounting of the night before, Louise tells us that her fiancé, John Paul McLeland, windmilled his arms with his rich kid approach to the fight, brandishing fists as if he were entering a ring, at her and then at Lee Townsend. He's staff. He's hired to work as a prep chef and a dishwasher. Lee makes quick work of John Paul, leaves him on the ground, blinking absent-mindedly. She says John Paul has gotten the notion that Louise is fooling around on him, which for the record, she says, this time, she isn't. John Paul McLeland actually got Louise the job at this camp. Louise is originally from the town of Shattuck, and usually counselor jobs don't go to townspeople. Townsfolk seem to be shuttled into jobs like prep chefs, commissary people, cleaning folk. Counselors tend to be reserved for college students. So she's pretty sure she's not going to get the job, but she does get the job, and like I said, she loves it. So John Paul was able to get Louise this job at Camp Emerson because his daddy is the Van Laar's bank lawyer. He's their lawyer. Rumor has it, John Paul is set to inherit the whole thing, the preserve and the enormous banking industry that Peter Van Laar I happened to build. So Louise is from Shattuck. She was her high school salutatorian and actually got a full ride scholarship to college, but she failed out of the first semester because she couldn't afford her books. She's done service work ever since, during the wintertime, living and working at the local lodge and spending her summers living and working at Camp Emerson. She's essentially raised herself, dealing with an absentee mom battling, it sounds like, pretty severe alcoholism or other substance use, and a revolving door of boyfriends that seem to accompany those habits. She has an 11-year-old brother, Jesse, whom she hopes to save from the clutches of trauma before he hardens. She hopes to save her 11-year-old brother Jesse by marrying John Paul McLeland Jr., showering Jesse with the tangible material goods, love, and supports that she never received herself, which is why she's put up with John Paul being abusive and generally quite terrible and not particularly good at anything or for anything at all. Like, he seems to have zero redeemable qualities, which he doesn't need them, I guess, is what the point of the book is, I think. They met at a frat party during her semester of college. He was a junior, she was a freshman. Already kind of iffy, but whatever. Ever since, for the last 4 years, they've been on again, off again due to his volatile temper and general unwillingness or inability to do anything pleasant or positive literally ever, because he's unreliable, entitled, and insecure. Louise, in a sort of transactional way, has been waiting for John Paul to graduate from college so that he can inherit his empire and he can buy her a fancy ring and they can buy a fancy house and she can move her brother into that fancy house and everything will be okay. There'll be a big happy family. They'll have 2 children, 4 bedrooms, whatever. The whole thing is worked out. But that can't start yet because John Paul McLeland has taken 6 years to graduate. And now that he has graduated, before he's destined to do what he's going to do for the rest of his life, poor guy, I know, he wants to take a year off and travel. So that's what he's been doing, allegedly. Worse than all of that, in his general kind of degenerateness, there is also one extreme episode of domestic violence between these two people, Louise and John Paul. Louise describes a winter. She's having a particularly bad day at the lodge and she's let off work early, so she goes to visit her boyfriend up at college. When she gets there, it's clear that he's having a party and there are lots of girls at this party and they seem to be vying for her boyfriend's attention. She, still in her work uniform, feeling dreary and gross, goes up to his room and falls asleep while the party rages on. And then she wakes up with him standing over her, furious at her, believing that she must have cheated on him in some capacity. He starts berating her, eventually goes to leave the room, and she says, "I hope you die." This triggers him to launch full-fledged attack. She narrowly escapes after some pretty extreme blows and finds herself with nowhere to go. So she ends up going to Camp Emerson, this place that she considers a sanctuary. It's the middle of the winter, so it's abandoned. TJ Hewitt, the camp director, finds her and gives her a home and a space to rest up in her own director's cabin, where she lives on the property full-time. So TJ Hewitt lets her stay in the director's cabin for a week while her face and body and soul heal. So that's freaking John Paul. I know, we're like starting at the top, but that's where we have to start in order for this all to make sense. The book unfolds itself deliciously, but in order to talk about it, I have to tell you these things in advance. Anyway, Barbara's missing. And before I get into that, let me explain TJ Hewitt. And that requires a little bit more of camp history, so bear with me. I promise it's tea. Okay, so there's been 3 Peter Van Laars, right? 3. The first one, the super enthusiastic conservationist, the reason he ultimately ended up buying the land, he credits that choice enormously to the Adirondack guide that led him through the land initially. And that person was Dan Hewitt. He hired the guide, Dan, full-time. He eventually asked him to stay on and help build his McMansion in this pristine area of wood, and afterward asked him to remain on as his personal guide through the forest and ultimately groundskeeper. So the home that Peter Van Laar I builds in the woods is named Self-Reliance. Though, if the chatter is to be believed, the whole town of Shattuck actually put the thing up. So it's fun and funny because rich people often attempt to delude and deceive the people around them by rewriting history. gaslighting them, even in the present moment. What happened happened the way I wish it did, and the way I wanted it to have happened, and I will insist that that was the reality or you will leave. I will pay you to pretend that you believe that is the reality too. So Dan Hewitt lives on the land, the original Van Laar, and eventually his son Victor will become the director and leader of the camp. Peter I regards the camp as his main pride and joy, the thing he is most proud to have achieved in his life. And that's saying something quite enormous to the people of Shattuck, but also to his family, because he has also built an enormous banking empire that his children, generations later, still continue to profit off and run. And I should mention that Peter I's regard to money was almost as if he had fallen into it. He seemed surprised to know that it was there. Now, that's one of the things said about him, but you should also know that Self-Reliance used to be a Swiss chalet, literally a chalet in Switzerland that he had deconstructed and brought over to this space in the Adirondacks. So he had to have some idea that he was rich. He's not that surprised that he's rich. Anyway, his children, like many of the children of the wealthy elite, grew up to be quite different than Peter I. They find a certain superiority and entitlement is their birthright because their father built wealth. Dan Hewitt, the original guide, eventually has twin boys and marries a woman named Clara, whom sadly dies shortly after the birth of the twins. So the boys, Vic and Charlie, are raised by their father Dan until, unfortunately, the boys are about 15 when their father dies, and they are taken in immediately by Peter Van Laar I. Apparently, the twin boys were about 6 years younger than Peter Van Laar's son, Peter II. Rumor has it that Peter II never liked the Hewitt boys, that he felt threatened by their relationship with his father. I'm sure you've never heard that story before. That's really new and original. Apparently, Van Laar I favored the boys. He loved Charlie and was kind to him, but who he really loved like a son, almost adopted even, never officially, was Vic Hewitt. Vic Hewitt has a daughter, eventually, and her name is TJ. TJ I would also lay my life down for. And now TJ acts as the head groundskeeper and director of Camp Emerson. She took over when her father could no longer handle the responsibilities and was no longer able-bodied in the way he needed to be to get the job done. He's in cognitive and physical decline, and the story that gets told about him is that I guess one year when all the campers arrived, he ended up shouting at one of the campers in full view of the parents, and Peter III went down to the camp immediately, quelled the concerns of the parents, said he would rectify the situation. Vic Hewitt was dismissed from camp, and his daughter took up the mantle pretty immediately. TJ is only asked to step in until they find a replacement, because at the time when she's asked to step in, she's like 22 years old. And she's a woman, which in the 70s was pretty unheard of for a woman to be a groundskeeper, let alone in charge of anything, I guess. But it's been 5 years, so now TJ Hewitt is 28 years old and has been running the camp, and it sounds like doing a superb job. Which brings us to Alice. When we're introduced to Alice's perspective, it's June of 1975, 2 months prior to Barbara Van Laar's bed being empty. When we meet her, she is counting the seconds until she can take her 5 p.m. sedative. We learn that she has been married to Peter Van Laar III, also yuck, I will explain, since she was 18 years old. They met because he served as her substitute escort for her coming out debut debutante ball. A debutante ball is when a young woman of high society is introduced to that society. Or, as I understand it, she is announcing that she is officially open to accepting marriage proposals. The internet says it could be a rite of passage, but the point was the debutante ball were a means for mothers to arrange advantageous marriages to other men of high society. You decide just how advantageous this marriage has been for young Alice. Anyway, she described him then, when she was 17, as cold. And she liked that. He wasn't originally supposed to be her escort. She needed a last-minute replacement, and her older sister, Delphine, who's married to a man named George, had a friend from college who was available that evening. The reason that those details are important is because Peter Van Laar III, the escort to 17-year-old Alice debut into society, is 29 years old, the age of her sister's husband. So the 17-year-old and the 29-year-old share 3 dances at the debutante ball, and 3 weeks later, she is being shuttled down to Self-Reliance with, of course, her sister as a chaperone to court Peter formally for, freaking marriage. But it's not really about marriage, it's about breeding. Immediately, Peter seems to regard her as a child, because she is. And while he shows a lot of disdain, reprehension for her older sister Delphine's articulate and inquisitive nature, wasted on a woman, he seems to respect Delphine for it. in a way that he simply does not respect Alice. Are you starting to understand my yuck a little bit? Wait, there's more. So Alice is chosen as a suitable breeding tool for the Van Laars and their ideas about what their ancestry and their family line deserve. She is married 2 days after her 18th birthday. She has no bridesmaids. She never had any close friends. There was no honeymoon, only departure to Albany, to a home she's never known, with a man she's barely met. 9 months later, their son, Peter IV, or affectionately known as Bear, is born. They call him Bear because as a baby, he reminds everyone of a baby bear. It's cute and weirdly endearing for this family that seems to have no soul otherwise. Alice immediately loves her son unequivocally and would spend all of her time with him if she were allowed. She says there were 1 or 2 good years at the start. Before and after Bear's birth, she tells us that Peter treated her as the child she was. That means he laughed at her a lot, but there was also warmth in his eyes. But at some point, when Peter decides that Alice should have grown past the mistakes that she routinely makes as it relates to her body, her appearance, and hosting guests, his amusement begins to morph into annoyance. By their 5th year together, when she's 22, he is often scowling and sometimes yelling. He's an extremely critical person. The only thing they have ever been able to agree on is the value of their son. They would have no more children, Peter III declared. 1 boy was enough, as was in tradition with all the generations before. The Van Laars are really concerned about heritage, and having more than 1 boy would complicate matters of inheritance. So they are done having children and thus done having sex. Alice tells us that she has the notion that her prompt production of a son, and such a fine one at that, was the only thing she ever did to please her husband. We learn that Peter III doesn't believe in cuddling, pretty much doesn't tolerate any sexual relationship with his child wife Alice, outside of procreation, which has immediately taken place. Alice, 18 and someone's mom, spends her days with her infant son, otherwise alone. Through the years, this family of 3 would summer at Self-Reliance. It becomes known amongst them that this is the time when they spend the most time together as a family. Peter III teaches his son to sail, to ride, and to play chess, and to shoot clay pigeons out of the sky. Oh, the fun we have. Peter III often doles out criticisms of Alice, her body, and her personality as if they are helpful feedback that she wants or needs. So he tells her often that she's a bad conversationalist. And honestly, 17-year-olds and 29-year-olds don't have a ton in common, so it makes sense that their conversation isn't rife with commonality, but her inability to articulate herself might have something to do with the fact that Alice was born and bred to be a doll, an accessory, a vessel, and unfortunately, she fulfills this role and believes in it. When her husband gives her any sort of advice, she takes it. He has thoughts on most facets of her appearance and personality. He tells her that she's more socially palatable when she's drinking. So she starts drinking a glass of brandy before each social event in full view of him to try to earn his approval. She originally undertakes drinking with a sort of martyrdom, a task she has to do in order to become who she needs to be. She isn't sure how and she isn't sure when, but at some point in time, the drinking morphs into something more. She tells us if there's cause for concern, Peter III will let her know. This is a person that has ultimately never developed discernment, and thus her being in any sort of parenting role is quite terrifying because she is a child herself and has given away all sense of autonomy or agency, or was never maybe granted it. It's a complicated conversation that we're going to get into further. So Alice, in June of 1975, is having a particularly bad day because today she has to have a conversation with TJ Hewitt. She's going to insist that TJ, camp director, bring on Barbara for this year's session of camp. The reason that's kind of an inconvenience is because camp started today. And so Barbara is already a day late for camp, and camp is full. Like, she is doing this as the last parent has dropped off the last kid. Like, the season has started. She knows that TJ won't like it. TJ is organized. She prefers to plan. I love TJ. TJ's full name is Tessie Jo, and she dresses androgynously, and she has her hair cut. She seems to have her hair in what is described as, but is never named, a bowl cut. And Alice thinks that's a real crime because the girl could actually be pretty. TJ has always been a tomboy, which in the 70s, I don't know if you know, is code for gay. TJ was only a few years older than Bear Van Laar. Bear used to follow her around all the time, trailing after her, looking up to her, learning from her, and Alice used to joke that Bear was in love with her. Alice takes her sedative pill 13 minutes early, and initially TJ's like, can't do it. Barbara can't join camp. Session's underway, cabins are full. Alice describes feeling a sort of rage, but it's underneath a kind of ocean. She can't reach it because of the sedative. She says TJ wouldn't be responding like this if Peter III were asking. And again, she's not asking. She says, "You know Barbara better than anyone, TJ. It'll be good for her." Because Barbara was born when TJ was 14. Alice eventually says, "You don't have a choice. I am not asking you." And with the shame of having to evoke her husband's name, she says it's what Mr. Van Laar wants. TJ says fine, she'll stay in Balsam. Then Alice feels an incredible sense of relief. How nice it'll be to not have 13-year-old Barbara stomping around the house this summer. She won't have to deal with the discomfort of watching Barbara eat and grow. The hours that Barbara spends weeping aloud, no longer bothering everybody. The servants pretending politely not to hear. Why do rich people ignore everything? What is wrong with you guys? So she's excited to have Barbara tucked neatly away at camp, which again is just down the lawn, safe but not bothersome. So Barbara Van Laar is 13 and the only child to Peter and Alice Van Laar. She has blonde hair that she's dyed jet black and she wears thick eyeliner and red lipstick. When we meet her, she is buttering bread, calm in the face of her mother's silent criticism and vocal passive aggression. Alice tells us she doesn't enjoy scrutinizing her daughter's growing body. She understands that as a concept, this is uncharitable, but she also believes that it's a part of her duty to be her daughter's first and worst critic. Where do you think she learned that? She believes it's her job to fortify her daughter in childhood, so that in womanhood she can gracefully withstand any assault thrown her way. Thereby, Alice takes it upon herself to be the original assailant, toughen her daughter to judgment by making sure she's surrounded by it always. Which I don't think is a super uncommon belief, I guess, and in part I understand why it happens, but I've also learned that healthy families recognize that there are two sides to that coin, an accountability side and an unconditional love haven. Ideally, your family members do not have any sort of opinion or stake in your body size or appearance. They are, however, meant to acknowledge and hold you accountable when they notice you behaving in a way that they think is counterproductive to your expressed interests, not their interests for you. When we see the people we love no longer holding themselves to the expectations we know they've set, when they're no longer working toward goals that we understand them to want to meet. It's not our job to attempt to control the people we love and to force our values or our ideas about what's best for them on them. It means acknowledging the reality of our family situation without imposing our own beliefs on the people we love. And this acknowledgement only works if it comes from a space of love, which is safe and secure and non-judgmental and entirely out of concern. There has to be an understanding of trust between the two people that the acknowledgement is taking place with. LOL, this is just called trust. I'm just describing trust. But Alice, assessing her daughter in this way, assessing her daughter's legs as she butters bread before dinner, this is not done out of love, but out of fear. This is done out of the belief that it is unsightly for her daughter to grow into a body to occupy the space that she now does. And she believes that if she finds it grotesque, other people will too. And she believes she'll be protecting her by bullying her and shaming her into changing into something that other people won't find gross. So by lobbing attacks at her now, she'll ensure that she grows into a woman with almost certainly an eating disorder. Great job, Alice. Listen, and that's a pretty bleak way to start this book, and I will tell you that you don't need to worry about Barbara. Barbara, while she's buttering that bread, she's just ignoring her mom. She doesn't even hear it. She seems to be wiser than the entire system that she was born into, and maybe that's the influence of T.J. Hewitt. But you're gonna be proud. Just wait. So Barbara is cleared for camp. Also, once Barbara is dispensed to camp, and I'll talk more about that in a second, Alice is wandering through the now quiet halls of her house and she finds a padlock on Barbara's door. And so she gets one of the staff people working in her house to help her open the padlock, and she goes into the room and she sees a mural painted there. And it sounds really beautiful. Alice would feel outraged if she had access to that feeling, but she can't because she's taken drugs to suppress it. So she feels fear on her daughter's behalf about what her father will do and say when he uncovers this information, and he's upset with Barbara as it is, more on that later. But she also feels jealousy that Barbara had the desire, the conviction, and the wherewithal, the agency to pursue a project like this. Alice says she has never once felt the agency that Barbara must have to have painted that mural there. So Alice goes out to the garage, finds a paint color called rose petal pink, and paints over Barbara's mural. Can you say Mother of the Year? And she has a staff member fix the door so that nothing will be out of place by the time Peter arrives. This is the logic of a child, that she is protecting her child by maintaining the illusion of harmony in an abusive and negligent home. It's also cowardice on the part of an extremely passive parent. Like, she might as well not even be there. She is literally erasing her daughter's conviction. And of course, Alice maybe never had a shot. I don't know. This is when we get into the space of systemic influence versus personal agency. Alice has just admitted to us that she has literally no agency. This is what she's been told her entire life's purpose is: maintain balance and harmony in the home. And because she has access to such money and such luxury and such resources, she's hard pressed to complain. She even shares with us that there are moments when she wakes up amongst these gorgeous and comfortable things and looks out at the picturesque lake and truly believes she's the luckiest woman in the world. Under capitalism and patriarchy, we're indoctrinated into social programming that trains us to value someone's fiscal worth above all, allow their economic standing to cancel out any and all other negative attributes like aggression, bigotry, racism, small-mindedness, misogyny, entitlement, being a little bitch. I'm looking at you, John Paul. And I don't believe that was an accident, because that system ensures all women find themselves in a position to compete or contort themselves into the fictional male idea of what a woman is supposed to be in order to garner resource for themselves and their future offspring, which this process was not always optional, not just because women didn't have rights or access to bank accounts, but further than that, these same powerful men restricted knowledge, research, access into things like sex education and birth control. It rearranges social hierarchy wherein money is the main value. And we see this depicted, or quite obviously, yes, in the relationship between Alice and Peter, which are two rich kids who have been bred to be rich and to make rich kids and to keep being rich and whatever, but also in Louise and John Paul, who hasn't had a child but feels herself responsible for a dependent anyway and is willing to compromise her need for love, happiness, safety in order to try to attain resource. And we can't blame her for it. We have to blame the system. Or can we blame her for it? That's what the book's about, I guess. Values are the things that drive our actions. A few generations ago, they used to have things called civics classes, wherein they learned values like civil-mindedness and social service and community, respect and responsibility. The wealthy elite, often insecure and pretty consistently with parental trauma wounds, have branded themselves superior because they're terrified that they are anything but. They've built a system wherein you can tangibly measure a person's worth because they believe they're so devoid of worth within themselves. They feel inferior to everyone around them all the time, and thus they've built a system and force everyone, pay everyone to operate inside of a delusion wherein they actually are the superior person that they have to convince everyone around them that they are, because they are so sure they are a tiny piece of shit. Which, some of us more than others. It's a fear-based approach. Fear of being ordinary, fear of being human, fear of being unremarkable, which they are because we all are. It's a fear of suffering, a fear of poverty, and the belief that the only way to safeguard one's future is by accumulating power over others. It's a belief that it's your personal responsibility to avoid exploitation, that everyone's a sinner and everyone's out to get you. It's a life without trust, and it's a life without love. The reason they have such a hard time locating their self-worth is because they do not love themselves, which I know sounds hokey, but is required in order to be able to move forward. It's a value trade, and it's not worth it, even in those blips in time in Alice's life where she thinks maybe it is. Alice can't really understand her neglect because she is simultaneously pampered, aka stripped of all decision and choice, but dressed in expensive clothing. And it's not that rich people tend to be worse because they have more, it's because having more has allowed them to get away with being less. Like all marginalized folks, anyone who has further hoops to jump through will get better at jumping through hoops. The corruption of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy means bent rules and almost non-existent consequences for a select few. Has usually been, for most of Western history, white guys. John Paul in 1975 does not have to compete for one of the highest paying jobs in the entire society. He believes inheriting this banking kingdom that the daddies and daddies before him built is his birthright, and thus all are automatically beneath him because of it. And whenever confronted with evidence, often, that this is not true, that he is actually significantly less educated or kind or understanding or equipped than most of the population, he will feel rage because this chafes against his delusion that he is the best and he is deserving of what he has been born into, that he is the best simply because he is. Alice has more, and yet women born into her position in society are bred to believe that their birthright, their birth duty, is to be less, to be a shell of a person, obedient and subservient, and to blend into whatever background you happen to be brought into. All of Alice's relationships are transactional, and they maybe all always have been. And transactional relationships means believing in earned worth. It's believing in superiority, genetic, familial, ancestral. It's the belief of ambition as logic and love as a foolish and unnecessary vulnerability. And in June of 1975, it's empty. It's heavy with the weight of the suffering of its occupants. Okay, on this same day that Alice has just had to force TJ Hewitt to accept a new camper, Barbara Van Laar, into the Monk Balsam, Tracy Jewell is arriving at camp. She's 12. She's dropped off at Camp Emerson by her father's significantly younger girlfriend, Donna Romano. She tells us that 3 rules are given to campers upon arrival. The first rule concerns food in cabins and how it's supposed to be eaten and stored, which is neatly, tightly. The second rule is about swimming, an activity to never, under any circumstances, be undertaken alone. And the third rule is, when lost, sit down and yell. 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 And I think that that is really interesting writing on behalf of Liz Moore. All of this is interesting writing because it doesn't say if lost, sit down and yell. It says when lost, implying the inevitability of losing oneself, which I think is a universal truth. I just think it's good. When lost, sit down and yell is a rule spoken very casually and very often. Tracy informs us that her father has paid her $100 to attend, 50% at departure, 50% to be received upon arrival back home. She had planned, would have preferred to have spent her summer in their family's usual Saratoga rental, wherein she has an elaborate reading ritual and prepares lots of elaborate snacks. As such has been her summer tradition for the last 5 years. We learn that Tracy's father has divorced her mother this last year, and that has brought on a lot of changes in Tracy's life. He'd gotten a new younger girlfriend, a fancier lifestyle, and the notion that Tracy shouldn't sit around the house all summer, that she should instead spend the summer that her father petitioned the custody court for miles away, learning about the great outdoors. Tracy suspects it has less to do with her learning and more to do with him and his new girlfriend wanting to hang around their new fancy house without a 12-year-old sulking around. Tracy tells us that her and her father actually used to be close. She sort of idolized him, followed him around, because her dad was a jockey's son who grew up too tall to race, play, partake. So now he's made a career out of horses in a different way. More daddy issues. I won't pretend I entirely understand Tracy's dad's job, but what it has meant for Tracy is that the circumstances of her life flip pretty drastically pretty often. She says when she was born, her and her parents lived in an RV, and now she lives in a large house with a silver gate in front of it in upstate New York. She says this is actually the longest her and her father have ever been apart. His insistence on sending her away, though she would never admit it, causes her heart to break. Tracy is also supposed to wear glasses, but she doesn't, believing that they signal her as an outsider. She has lots of red hair and freckles. Her father once told her casually that she was built like a plum on toothpicks. And it was at once so cruel and so poetic that it clicked into place around her like a harness. That's a good line. That line inspired this channel. Tracy is not a child who feels a sense of belonging or escapes from her social anxieties, save for when she's with her mother and her mother's friends, around whom she feels comfortable, sociable, and fun. She finds that when kids her age try to interact with her, she opens her mouth to speak and nothing comes out. She freezes. Tracy's father hasn't even bothered to drive her to the camp that he is shuttling her off to. She spends the long ride making casual conversation with his much younger girlfriend, Donna Romano, while she chain smokes. So Donna is dropping Tracy off among the other campers and parents. Tracy is informed of the rule, and it will echo in Tracy's head for days, for weeks, for the rest of her life. Tracy wonders how lost she'd really have to be in order to get to a space where she would sit down and shout, yell, plead for assistance. It embarrasses her just to think of it. There's a skit seminar during her first night of camp, and that skit is full of silly little idioms, but also lots of good information about the woods and the forest. We learn that 65% of people are less than 20 feet from a trail when they begin to feel disoriented. She imagines the pull of the dark woods, the feel of them encompassing you, and then the slow, dawning horror remember that you are not where you think you are. In fact, you have no idea where you are at all. So this is Balsam. This is the director's cabin where TJ Hewitt lives. This is the preserve where, until every summer before, the Van Laars have remained intentionally and distinctly separate from camp. The entrance of Barbara Van Laar into Camp Emerson is the first time that the family has crossed the staff to family line, I guess. And also in breaking with tradition, Barbara Van Laar will be attending this session a day late. Tracy learns on her first day of camp that these girls have known each other for years, reuniting summer to summer, woven together with inside jokes and shared experience. Tracy also learns that there is a hierarchy amidst the cabin of Balsam. At the top, obviously, were the counselors, Louise, the lead counselor, and Annabelle, 17-year-old counselor in training. Tracy says she's obsessed with them immediately, both in their own way. She describes Louise as short and, even as a 23-year-old, something of a woman. She has long dark hair and dark eyebrows and the bearing of an athlete. Tracy also notes that she is stacked. And I'm not ashamed to say that I had to look up what stacked would have meant in the 70s. Evidence attached. Annabelle, the counselor in training, is 17, tall and willowy, fair. A ballet dancer who moved with the assurance of someone whose family had never had to worry about paying a bill. She finds them both extremely beautiful, loves them both immediately, and feels a sort of weird desire to play with them like dolls. Next in the hierarchy are campers of various status. Tracy finds herself a silent outlier amidst their ranks. She chooses to sit at the end of the table during every mealtime and reads during social hour. When unpacking her bags, she silently accepts her fate for this summer, not participating, waiting for it to be over, enduring her loneliness. She tucks her new glasses at the back of a drawer. It would be better, she thought, not to see anything too clearly this summer. All that changes, though, with the arrival of Barbara Van Laar the next day. She would have caused a stir simply because of who she is and the amount of majesty or prestige that the folks of the Van Laar preserve have on the campers. But she also causes a stir because she's arriving late to session and she insists on walking down the lawn to camp rather than arriving in the car with all of her belongings. She's also dressed in cut-off jeans and intentionally ripped stockings. She wears black army boots and a t-shirt with some sort of slogan on it that everyone doesn't really know but thinks is probably rude. The whispers that go around is that she's punk. Tracy notes that this choice of appearance would have deemed her an automatic outcast if she wasn't in fact Barbara Van Laar, but because she is, it makes her all the cooler. Barbara joins Bunk Balsam for their swim test and outpaces everybody, winning handedly. She immediately ignores everyone in favor of Tracy, standing next to her, sharing her bunk, and sneaking her sidelong smiles. Barbara attempts to talk to Tracy on a few occasions, but every single time Tracy opens her mouth to respond, she can't think of anything to say. So she prepares a list of questions from the bottom bunk to ask Barbara Van Laar so that she can engage her in some sort of conversation. She desperately wants to talk to her. On Tracy's second night of camp, she overhears two other campers talking. One says, "It's awful, isn't it? Being born to be a replacement for your brother?" Caroline. Okay, Camp Emerson is most famous for its survival trip, which was originally called Solo Trip, wherein campers were dispersed throughout the woods and told to survive on their own for multiple days. Thanks to intervention from a new generation of parents, campers were now sent off into groups of 12. And this year, they're all going to be accompanied by some form of counselor. That counselor will be out of sight, only there in case of an emergency, but due to parental concern, changes had to be made to the trip. No camper had ever died, but tales had been passed down of malnourished campers stumbling through the woods. Twice a week throughout a camp session, campers and their survival trip groups will meet with TJ Hewitt to learn the skills necessary to survive in the wilderness. They're preparing for this tradition. The groups are all made of 12 campers from different bunks, and they're comprised of all the age ranges of the camp, so there's the same amount of skill dispersed in each group. Each group has the same ratio of child to adolescent. And Tracy is once again delighted to see that Barbara is in her group. Also in her group is a 14-year-old boy named Lowell Cargill, one of the oldest campers. He has shoulder-length hair, a shell necklace, and is just about the most beautiful person that Tracy has ever seen. In her first survival class, TJ explains the origin of the word panic. Listen up, because this is fucking good. It came from the Greek god Pan, the god of the woods. He liked to trick people, to confuse and disorient them until they lost their bearings and their minds. So to panic, which I don't know about you guys, but I am occasionally prone to, as is Tracy. So to panic is to lose one's mind, to the disorienting circumstance, to be ungrounded. TJ says to panic is to make an enemy of the forest. To stay calm is to be its friend. Liz goddamn Moore. Freaking chills. I feel sick So Tracy asks Barbara these questions one night, and Barbara leans over the bunk and is like, "Are you interviewing me? Why do you have a notebook of questions?" They establish a friendship, and Barbara immediately asks Tracy if Tracy can keep a secret. Barbara says she's going to be leaving the bunk some nights. And can Tracy not tell anyone? She also asks if they can trade bunks. That way it's easier for Barbara to sneak out. Tracy says the only thing that Barbara lied about was that these nocturnal excursions would take place some nights, because they do in fact take place every single night, and Tracy is never awake when Barbara returns. There's also this thing that goes pretty much unacknowledged, and that is that Barbara does not seem to need sleep, which makes me wonder. Back to Louise. 2 months later, it's August 1975, and Barbara is missing from her bunk. Louise deduces that her counselor in training, Annabelle, who was supposed to be on duty last night, whose parents are currently sleeping up at the Van Laar Preserve because they are close friends of the Van Laars, seems to be hungover. Louise herself had been out, smoked a bit of a joint, had a few beers, and of course fled the aggression and abuse of her fiance, John Paul McLeland. Annabelle throws up immediately after waking, and Louise tells Annabelle that Barbara is gone. Don't say missing. Louise tries to remember if Barbara was there when she tiptoed into the cabin last night, well past curfew. Louise throws the butt of the joint and the empty beer bottles into the bag that Annabelle just threw up in. She tells Annabelle to get rid of it, and to also tell everyone, any adults that ask her, that they were both in the cabin last night, because Louise has already done the math and recognizes that neither of them being on duty the night that a child goes missing, and not just any child, the child of the owner of the camp, the second child that's gone missing in these very woods. There are a lot of implications here, and those implications for Louise, an adult, might include jail time. Louise, as she walks away from Annabelle, though, thinks immediately that that girl's gonna fold. She's a girl who's been told her whole life that she is lovable and cared for and assured of her place in this world. Annabelle has even confided in Louise that her parents have already selected the boy that she's to marry. Anyway, Louise goes out into her cabin and feigns confusion for her just now waking campers. Where's Barbara? She immediately goes to TJ Hewitt, camp director. She knocks on the door knowing that TJ's schedule is really strict. She's always in the same place at the same time, but TJ is not in her home, which is where Louise expected her to be. So Louise goes inside of TJ's cabin and hears TJ showering. And she knows that she shouldn't wait for TJ to finish showering. We have a potentially missing girl here. Time is of the essence. So given the severity of the circumstances, TJ has to now open the bathroom door on her boss, who is currently showering. And at that exact moment that she opens the door, the shower water turns off and TJ yanks back the curtain to find Louise in her bathroom. I'm so sorry. What in the hell, Louise? It's about Barbara Van Laar. Louise fills her in, so she wasn't in her bunk this morning. Silence. Louise knows there's a good chance that TJ is going to hold Louise accountable for Barbara's disappearance. Louise is an adult, and it's her job to make sure all of her campers are accounted for. More than that, a counselor's job is to listen, is to hear things. The cruel words spoken by one camper to another. A clap of thunder in the distance. Everybody out of the water. But you were in the cabin last night, says TJ. You and Annabelle both? Yes, says Louise. And she's not a habitual liar, but she's a practical one. She says it never feels good to lie, especially when she's lying to someone like TJ, who values above all honesty and integrity, and who she respects enormously. A person to whom she's confessed things to which she's never confessed to another soul. It actually makes her feel sick to her stomach to lie to TJ. So TJ makes an announcement over the camp intercom, calling all counselors to the director's cabin and putting the CITs in charge. She says, "You seen him this week?" Louise lies for a second time. No. A search starts for Barbara at 7 a.m. in August of 1975. TJ says, how has she seemed this season? Happy? Comfortable? Anyone she got along with? Never said anything that indicated she might run off? All of the counselors are assigned areas covering the entire scope of the property to search for Barbara. Before they can split off, a new counselor asks a question. Was her brother a camper? The Van Laar boy? There's an understanding at camp that Bear's name is one that should only be spoken in whispers, and never in front of TJ, who was said to have known him well. Louise remembers when he went missing. She was 9. No, says TJ. There was never a camper here. All right, get going. Louise is assigned staff quarters, and as she's on her way there, she's thinking about John Paul. She says that she can logically understand that the reason that she's staying with him is because he represents her pathway to what she considers a better life. He's also associated with that year at Union, the college she went to, back when her dreams still felt possible. She's met his family only on 3 occasions, and every single time they reintroduce themselves to her with pretty significant disinterest, and they actually seem to be annoyed that she was present at all. Not really the treatment that a fiance gets. John Paul has told her that he likes Louise because she's different than everyone else in his world. Louise routinely reassures herself that they are engaged. She is his fiance. He's gonna get a ring once he has a job and is able to afford a ring, as soon as his dad gives him a job. Louise is amazing and very resourceful and very kind and quite wise in so many ways, but when she talks about John Paul, she seems So naive. It's almost heartbreakingly unbelievable that she bought this and put up with everything that it entailed until we remember the trauma. Louise tells us that her room at her mother's house is littered with report cards, all A's and A pluses, that she hung up, trophies and accolades of academic and future promise that she displayed with triumph, that she now regards as pathetic, that she was the one that hung them up, that no one really cares about her achievements or her potential or her success in life. Louise is also a gorgeous young woman that has been slandered by the people of her small town quite often, starting at a young age. The implication is that the rumors started because multiple boys at a point in time were interested in Louise, and regardless of the fact that she never interacted with any of them, word got around in a time and place where word seems to be law. Louise says she's had to figure out how to get on regardless of what people say about you. And we learned that Louise never actually fooled around on John Paul. There was an incident where she says she was too incapacitated. It sounds like she was taken advantage of. Sounds like she was assaulted. Why am I wincing words? And as was normal at the time, or as what's normal now, she was blamed for that assault by the person that is supposed to most intimately protect her and the society around her. Louise comes to terms this morning, the night after an altercation where her boyfriend got sucker punched, with a certain shame and humiliation that she has poured 4 years down the drain for a future that will never come to fruition. So she thinks about Lee Townsend, who arrived with a flurry and is very handsome and funny and humble. He's a prep chef and a dishwasher, and traditionally, staff members and counselors don't really mix. Echo of the dynamic between the Van Lairs and their staff, the various hierarchies going on within the land of the rich. But Lee is fine looking and tall and young. He has shoulder length hair. Again, I guess all the cute guys do. And he gives an impression of speed and lightness. And over the last few months, Lee and Louise have engaged in a low-level flirtation. She says he sparked a desire in her that she has never felt before. So John Paul, who has been supposedly traveling the world for the last year, is in town for 6 nights and doesn't come to see his fiancée, Louise, any of those nights. And it's this logic, coupled with this desire, that prompted Louise to leave her cabin last night past curfew and seek out Lee Townsend. She gets to the bonfire and sits with him for less than 2 minutes before John Paul McAllen shows up. He stomps into the clearing, antagonizing Lee. In 2 quick swings, Lee had him on the ground. John Paul the aggressor, but still the first to fall. Lee looks at Louise almost an apology after he has to knock this guy out, and he's like, boyfriend? And Louise says, fiance. And she immediately regrets it because she's never spoken of John Paul with Lee. Lee also reveals that he knows John Paul, but can't tell her exactly how because of dealer-client confidentiality. Lee asks her if she needs help, offers to stay with her, offers to get John Paul back to the main house. Louise says she can handle it. John Paul calls Louise a whore, and she says she's been called that before, once or twice by her own mother, and generally it doesn't faze her, but in front of Lee, she feels ashamed. While Louise is searching the staff quarters that next morning, the place is entirely empty because everyone is working the kitchen morning breakfast shift right now. When who does she run into but Lee Townsend? Apparently he had a maple syrup stain, so he's changing his shirt. She ends up enfolded in his arms. She's crying into his chest. He's a big dude, and usually that feels threatening to her, but for some reason today feels safe and protective and warm. Lee says that Louise ought to mess around a bit before she settled down with her fiance. He apologizes for hitting him, and Louise says, don't be, he deserved it. Lee says Barbara's probably fine, probably just ran away. That brings us to Alice of August 1975, the day her daughter has been found missing. Her phone is ringing somewhere in her house and no one's answering it, and that's making her really angry because she pays a lot of people to do the things around here. She says probably everyone else in the house is as bad off as she is because everyone was indulging last night, even Peter 3, who usually regards his abstinence as his highest quality and trait. Sounds like so much fun to be around. Cold, abstinent, who keeps a running count of every glass Alice has, was feeling his oats last night. I'm gonna start saying that. I'm not good today. I was feeling my oats last night. Alice is most of the time throughout the rest of this book in some sort of fog or haze, dreaming about her lost son, Bear, chasing Bear through her dreams and through her life. Alice tells us that her bedroom is across the hall from the largest bedroom, which is Peter's. Alice ends up answering the phone because no one else seems to be getting it, and it's a sergeant from the police station. He apologetically tells her that her daughter Barbara is missing. She lists things that she can see, smell, taste, touch. Okay, so here's the map again, right? Barbara is supposed to be here, and her parents are here, and she's gone missing, and they never check it out. They never go well, I want to see your bunk. Oh my God. Now I'm going to tell you about Jacob Sluter. The camp kids call him Slitter. He is one of 2 camp ghost stories that sort of terrify the young campers. The first is Scary Mary. She's this old woman ghost that has been spotted on the edges of the grounds. The second, Slitter, a serial killer who had been apprehended about a decade prior in this exact area for the murder of several women. He was arrested in the vicinity of the camp. We get his perspective too, LOL. So Jacob Sluter, in a prison somewhere, a decade after he's been apprehended, hears a voice in his head, Limp Jacob. And eventually he figures out that the voice in his head is saying Limp, Jacob. And thus he devises a scheme wherein he feigns paralysis, and this results in him being transferred to a temporarily less secure prison, and it's only several weeks while he's here before he escapes that prison. So for the first time in a decade, Jacob Sluter is on the lam. This brings us to part 2. Bear. Bear Van Laar is 8 years old when he goes missing on July 10th of 1961. He goes missing the day after the last Black Flag goodbye is held on the Van Laar property. Bear is regarded as the pride and joy of his entire family. Alice, his mother, loves him consumingly and unconditionally, and the boy responds to her with kindness and gentleness and understanding. Peter, 3, the boy's father, loves him from afar, viewing him more as an asset that is appreciating, an investment that he will eventually cash out on. More than that, Bear is kind and familiar with all of the staff. His mother says that he went so far as to learn all of the staff's names, and she regards this as like the height of character, which it tells us a lot about the boy. He doesn't see that invisible line that the Van Laars seem to insist upon. He establishes relationship with everyone on the ground, including or especially the townsfolk that work for them. He's in love with the land in a way that is lacking from the 2 Peters prior, and he's very close with Tessie Joe and friends with the other children invited to the Black Flag Goodbye gathering, notably the Lelands, John Paul and his sister Marnie. Alice says this particular Black Flag Goodbye is going wonderfully, better than ever before. Peter, 3, is in a really relaxed and positive mood. She even caught him sitting and reading a paper, and she really hasn't seen him sit in like many years. She says Bear brings them together, something they can both agree on wholeheartedly. And while she says that, there's a few really heartbreaking passages in the book about night and day nurses that Peter, 3 hires for Alice and for Bear. He makes Alice use these nurses and defers to their expertise over her motherly instinct and intuition, and it's just really painful and awful. She'll hear Bear crying at night when he's an infant, and she'll go to him, and Peter and the night nurse will like force her out. So they definitely agree that he's incredibly lovable in their own definition of lovability. If he brings them together, it's because they're forced to share him. We learn that Alice's sister, Delphine, her husband George, has sadly died, and that's a real bummer. They seem to have a real love match. They completed each other. They were both odd and strange and peculiar in their own way, and they seem to kind of balance one another out. Delphine still attends the Black Flag Goodbye, even though it's a little bit inappropriate for a single woman of her repute. In fact, Delphine's first year back to the Black Flag Goodbye on her own, during one of the many intellectual games that the guests are forced to play, Delphine is annoyingly intelligent and is such, ruining the game for everyone else. She used to have George bounce her obscure knowledge off of, but now she seems to be alone in her thinking. She's fostered a close teaching relationship with Bear and good-naturedly tolerates the looks, the talk, and the general demeanor and attitude of all of the wealthy assholes she's surrounded by. On Delphine's first year attending without George, Alice walks by her sister's room at night and hears Delphine crying, and she assumes it's because Delphine has overheard these other guests talking shit about Delphine and how smart she is, which, not an insult, being too smart, for being too educated, which is something Alice is particularly sensitive about because she is regarded as too dumb by all of these other guests. And Alice shares a bit of her psychology with us. She tells us that even though she knows her own mother will always find something to critique about her hosting abilities or her appearance, she still believes it's her job to anticipate, outwit, and maneuver past her mother's criticism. She believes that one day she might show up in a way that satisfies the people around her. She still aims to render her mother speechless with her wifely and hosting perfection. So she's projecting some of this onto Delphine. But Delphine is quickly like, oh, I don't care what those people say. I'm only here to feel a little bit closer to George, even though he just tolerated them. So Delphine confides that she's actually just crying about George, and she's always crying about George. And in this rare, or potentially the only moment of intimacy and vulnerability between these two sisters, Delphine asks Alice if she's happy, if Peter treats her well. So she's always kind of worried about making that introduction and whether or not Alice is going to stand stand up to a man that she perceives as kind of domineering. Delphine suggests that Alice attend university now that Bear is old enough to go to school, and Alice says Peter wouldn't like it, and Delphine says, and if you insisted? Alice is kind of floored by that idea because she's never insisted upon anything inside of their marriage the entire time they've been married. When Alice returns to her bedroom, Peter questions where she was. She wasn't in Bear's room, so where the heck was Alice? They have all these guests on the property. It's implied that he thinks she's been unfaithful, and we also learn that apparently there was an incident with a guest years earlier, and Alice was too incapacitated to be at fault, and that guest has not been invited back. So Peter regards her with suspicion whenever he can't find her where he thinks she should be. When she gets back to bed, she says she was with Delphine, and Peter says he thinks Delphine is quite manipulative, and that everyone was really worried when George got together with her that he might change. And you know something? He did. And we know that George probably changed for the better, but the Van Lairs are too obtuse and emotionally stunted and blind to see that. Anyway, so in 1961, a few years after the Delphine stuff, Alice and Peter and Bear, all the guests of the Van Lairs, are having perhaps the best Black Flag goodbye that has ever been hosted. And in fact, on the last day, Alice goes into her room to find Peter resting there, and he invites her to rest with him, and they have sex and cuddle in a way that they never have in the decade prior of marriage. Alice finds herself crying afterward, and Peter patronizingly soothes her, cooing at her, asking what's wrong. She doesn't explain it to him, but she's crying for herself on what she has clearly missed out on as it relates to intimacy and love and romantic, physical, emotional connection. Alice believes that she is perhaps falling in love with her husband again, and he is perhaps falling in love with her for the first time now that she's not so embarrassingly young. That's a deficiency on her part. Like, they didn't know they chose her when she was 17. On the last day, during the last cocktail hour, surrounded by all of their guests, Peter 3 stands up and says, "Stay. Don't go tomorrow. Stay an extra day. Let's prolong the fun. Let's keep having a good time. Let's not make today the last day. Everyone stay." And everyone's like, "Woo, we'll stay." But Delphine and the other staff members recognize that this is an enormous imposition and an enormous ask, because everyone on the property will have to rearrange their travel, of course, but more so arrangements regarding food and cleanliness and the lodging of all the folks working to ensure that there's breakfast and cocktails and clean linen and surface area not covered in the filth and grime of the extremely wealthy. It's enormously inconsiderate. But that feels like too tame of a word. Like, it's just dickish to insist that all the hands working to make Self-Reliance look good and feel good and smell good this week continue working past the date they've been contracted for and figure it out on the fly. What if they have other obligations? Delphine ascertains all of this and in front of everyone asks Peter 3's house manager if that's okay, if he had other plans, if he could make it work. Peter 2, Peter 3's daddy, assures Delphine this is fine and considerate of her to ask, but also not her place. Peter 3's good mood is immediately ruined. He's furious. Who is Delphine to question him, a single woman in his house, to speak directly with his staff as if they are two people instead of servant and guest? How improper, how repulsive. Alice is forced to apologize on her sister's behalf profusely. Around this same time, we meet Carl Stoddard, the man who will eventually take the fall for the disappearance and murder of Bear Van Laar. Yeah. Carl Stoddard is 1/4 of Shattuck's volunteer police department, and he also works under Vic Hewitt at the preserve doing landscaping. Also on the volunteer fire department are a grocer, a town history teacher, and a man who's largely unemployed. So Carl receives a call from Peter 3 at 7 p.m. at the volunteer firehouse. Carl Stoddard, father of 3 girls, recently lost his son to a medical complication, a long health battle. Him and his wife have been emotionally and financially wrecked by this tragedy, but the two of them are determinedly making it work for their 3 surviving daughters. We are inside Carl's brain for several chapters, and I would describe him as such: gentle, kind, warm, hardworking, considerate, a person who thinks before spoken word or action. These qualities are demonstrated in his thought process, but also in small examples of his interactions with his wife, Marianne, in the book. It's such a good book. Carl tells us that the jobs available in Shattuck are few and far between. He has a whole host of medical debt to pay, grief to fend off, and at least 5 mouths to feed. He gets the job landscaping for Vic Hewitt because a friend recommends him, tells him about what happened to Carl's boy. Carl tells us that he is just now cresting over a several-year-long learning curve that he suspects several times has led to Vic Hewitt falling on the sword on his behalf. Despite him being a relative novice, he likes the work with plants, and he's developed a relationship or a friendship with Bear Van Laar, taught him how to whittle, and he tells us that Bear reminds him of his own son, Scotty, who is now died. And Carl, through this relationship, becomes privy to something that no one else on the preserve is willing to name or recognize, and that is that Bear has an uncomfortable relationship with his grandfather. Bear doesn't seem to like his grandfather because his grandfather speaks to him in a really harsh and critical way. So Carl takes this call from Peter 3, and Peter 3 says his son is missing. And Carl says, Bear? On the way to the preserve and their makeshift fire truck, Carl fills the others in on what he knows, and that is that this afternoon, Bear left to take a hike with his grandfather in the woods. Bear turned around at the trailhead to go back for his pocket knife, and he never returned. This is the last anyone has seen of Bear Van Laar. It's dark by the time the volunteer fire department arrives at the preserve, and they are greeted by Vic Hewitt, who is regarded as an extremely skillful guide and a stoic man, but he can look something fierce because he's missing a little bit of his right earlobe, and he's said to have lost it in a fight with a black bear. Everyone inside of Self-Reliance gives the appearance of having recently searched the woods. And because it's the last day of the Black Flag Goodbye, the people inside of Self-Reliance are kind of randoms. Carl's antenna are kind of going up because, one, the family has waited a really long time to alert any sort of authorities to the disappearance of their son. And the volunteer fire department of Shattuck are not exactly the height of authority or professionalism. So many people have already trampled through the woods that searching for Bear or finding any sort of tracks is not likely. Any clue as to the boy's whereabouts have all but been erased. Or 4, it's rained. So combined with the trampling, they don't have any idea where to begin for their search for Bear. As the family fleshes out their story as to the last places they all identified Bear, Carl realizes that he, in fact, may have been the last person to see Bear alive when he left the property today around 3 o'clock. He says he saw Bear on the front porch, tying his shoe. But Carl understands what would change the moment he reveals this information. It comes out when the family insists that Bear was wearing shorts, and Carl says no, he was wearing long pants. He cuffed him. Carl, says Vic, any reason you wouldn't have told us that earlier? Just came to me, just now. The fire department asked Vic Hewitt if they should shout, search the woods. Hewitt says nah, would probably agitate the family further, and we wouldn't want to worry anybody. It's now nighttime, there's been some sort of storm. Bear's mother has been confined to her room because the whole thing has just been so upsetting. It is decided that a search will be arranged for the morning, but for now, everyone should just go home and go to sleep. And just like for perspective, like their 8-year-old son has gone missing in the woods, and they're like, I guess we'll call it for the night? What? Also, Tessie Jo, Vic's daughter, went missing around the same time. Everyone assumed she was off looking for Bear and was just so upset by his absence because they spend nearly every summer together and they're best friends, or maybe the only friend that Tessie Jo has. Before the search wraps up, Tessie Jo comes hurtling out of the woods and into the arms of her father. She looks quite traumatized. Her hair is matted to her head. She's white as a ghost. When she's taken away to get warm, to have dry clothes put on her, the fire department wonders if maybe she saw something. Carl says maybe she's just upset that he's gone. And this sentiment is later echoed by Vic, who says that Bear is her only friend and she's distressed and traumatized to think that he's missing. As Carl pulls their makeshift fire truck out of the drive on the preserve, they watch every light in Self-Reliance blink out. So their 8-year-old son is lost in the woods and his mother is locked up in her room. The family is more concerned about causing an undue ruckus than about locating their son, than retrieving their boy from the woods I presume that they believe have claimed him, and they're turning the lights off despite the fact that that might be the only signal to call their lost son home. Carl thinks that if it was his boy, he would be out in the woods, calling until his own body gave out. The next morning, the fire department arrives to find that their place has been usurped by the police. Nearly all the town of Shattuck has arrived to comb the woods for the boy. They are performing a sweep, looking for unusual colors or depressions in the earth. They're meant to march forward in an equidistant line to cover as much ground as possible, calling out for the boy. Carl notes that this is the hardest part for him, and nearly all the men. He notes that it's the women's voices he hears most. Women are more willing to yell through the woods. All of them were mothers. All of them regularly set aside their innate sense of propriety to holler with abandon for their children. Like, come on. That's fantastic writing. An hour goes by, 2, 3. Carl finds himself sweating pretty intensely, despite the lack of heat. Carl finds himself ruminating about the way the bear would jump at the sound of his grandfather's voice. Carl says he's not feeling very good, and usually Marianne would notice such things when one of her family was ill or sick or nervous, but today she has her attention focused elsewhere. Can't stress enough the entire town of Shattuck that this family considers themselves superior to. Thus, the people they consider inferior have closed their grocery stores. Many jobs are going undone, paychecks unsigned, unclaimed, to search the woods for their boy. Carl says the landscape is beginning to blur in front of him, and suddenly he stumbles, falls to the ground. There's a vice-like twisting in his stomach and chest. Suddenly he can say no words, and people are shouting his name. He fades out. Part 3, When Lost. We're back with Tracy in July of 1975. She says she's afraid to use the word, but she's pretty sure she's in love with Barbara Van Laar. Barbara is the first friend that Tracy's ever had that seems to like Tracy as much as she likes Barbara. Through this friendship, though Barbara rarely explicitly shares anything about her personal or family history, Tracy comes to understand that Barbara does not revere TJ Hewitt the way the rest of the campers do. All the camp counselors are regarded as celebrities in their own right. Information about their home and romantic lives squirreled and traded like gold. But TJ Hewitt, the camp director, is revered with an authority, a respect, and awe. But through interactions, it just becomes clear to Tracy that they're really close. When asked, Barbara discloses that TJ was like a babysitter to her, coming up to Albany when her family was away for long trips, looking after her, spending time with her all summer, visiting her at school, teaching her the ways of the land. The Hewitts are like family. And what we know that Tracy doesn't know is that the Hewitts shouldn't be like family. They should be family, particularly considering Peter 1's relationship with TJ's dad, Vic. The person that drew this line was Peter 2, through his own understanding that he was somehow superior to Vic despite the fact that his father was favoring him. So the only reason that they aren't family and they are merely like family is because Peter 2 was threatened by the love his father gave a fatherless Vic Hewitt. All comes down to fragile men who think their daddy should have loved them more. We should have guessed, given all the slander about women with daddy issues. So obvious in hindsight. Regardless of what she learns about Barbara, she knows that she shouldn't ask about Bear. Tracy learns from Lowell Cargill, her camp crush, who reads the paper and plays guitar, he's not like other boys, that Jacob Sluter, or Slitter, is on the lam, and has in fact been spotted closer and closer to the land that is Camp Emerson. Remember though, Sluter was accused and prosecuted for the murder of 11 women. His MO was single adult women, killings that took place between 1960 and 1964. He confessed nothing and maintained his innocence, despite the extremely damning evidence. Possessions of the victims, fingerprints at all the crime scenes, testimonies from 2 siblings depicting sadistic tendencies. It's actually theorized that Sluter is responsible for more killings than even he was prosecuted for. Cases previously thought to be missing persons were reopened when he was apprehended. Tracy wonders if perhaps Bear Van Laer's missing persons case would be on that list. Lowell invites Tracy to harmonize with him, and they sing a camp song in what is the most erotic moment of Tracy's young life at this point. He's trying to get better at singing. They sing a song together. It's from her mother's collection. She thanks her mother profusely in her mind. And when she returns to Balsam, Barbara and her talk about kissing, and then Tracy takes to her notebook to write down everything she knows about sex, just in case, which is almost nothing. 2 months in the future, in August of 1975, Tracy has known for 1 hour that Barbara is missing. And because Tracy knows what none of the other adults know, that Barbara sneaks out every single night to meet an older boyfriend, Tracy has yet to think the worst. Tracy does not want to be responsible for ratting out the only friend she's ever had. So she decides to venture out to the place where Barbara told her she was meeting that older boyfriend. It's an observer's cabin at the peak of Hunt Mountain. Barbara told Tracy she runs it in half an hour. She knows these woods like the back of her hand. So Tracy, believing that perhaps Barbara has fallen asleep with her older boyfriend and simply hasn't made it back on time, decides to unwisely and perhaps even disrespectfully take a quick hike to the peak of Hunt Mountain and the observer's cabin. She'll walk herself there without the proper shoes, equipment, provisions, or direction to find Barbara, and if she's not there, then when she gets back, she'll tell the authorities. It is not long, with Tracy off path and without glasses, in an unfamiliar and unforgiving wood, having disregarded every single thing that TJ painstakingly taught her over the summer. But at nearly 13, Tracy swings wildly between self-abasement and overconfidence. There is no middle ground. Tracy finds herself disoriented. She begins counting to gauge how much time has passed. When she estimates 10 minutes have passed without her seeing the sun or the mountain, she allows herself to acknowledge what she's done. She's covered too much ground now, been lost for truly half a mile. She sits down and yells. Introducing Yudita, 26. She was born and raised in Schenectady. I know I'm not saying that right. Schenectady. She is the 3rd child to a family with 3 brothers. She is one of the nation's first class of female state troopers to graduate. 5 years have passed since that time, and day 1 of the Barbara Laar missing persons case is her first full day as an investigator on the job. She's been promoted. She is working under Denny Hayes, who seems to have appointed himself Judy's mentor. Immediately, Denny Hayes mentions that the Van Laar's other child, Bear, has been missing for 14 years. He says, interestingly enough though, they already caught the guy that killed that little boy, in reference to Carl Stoddard. Sick fellow, but he's dead now. Another kid goes missing from the same place? Who done it now? Denny suspects she's a runaway. Girl her age goes missing, it's almost always a runaway. Complicating everything, says Denny, is another camper has gone missing, Barbara's bunkmate, Tracy. In light of these disappearances, all the campers have been gathered in the Great Hall, and parents are being called, and campers will be dispersed tourists back to their home, the season will end early. Though the Van Laar family is super against that. 2 campers have gone missing, one of them their own daughter, and they're like, no, don't close the season, don't send people home, don't make a fuss, don't want any unnecessary alarm. And I think it's meant to illuminate how often rich people refuse to cause necessary alarm. Extreme wealth often allows people to purchase their way out of consequences, or otherwise avoid consequences. In big ways, demonstrated by John Paul, right? A degenerate white guy set to inherit an ungodly amount of power and wealth, despite failing grades, a drinking problem, and a volatile temper that leads him to violence. And in small ways, like not having to clean up after a party, not picking up your wet bathing suit off the floor, not washing dishes despite eating off of them. The rich don't engage with cause and effect the same way that the rest of the humans do. They've come to engage with consequences in a way that is literally delusional, and thus they find themselves staunchly unwilling to acknowledge the permanent reality of the situation, believing that they can pay people to participate in that delusion, which, for the most part, we exist inside of a system wherein we willingly do this. The most obvious example I can think of is a wealthy older man and a young attractive woman. The delusion is, you, young woman, pretend you desire me, old man, pretend that you look up to me and that you want to share my company, you're attracted to me, and you'll maybe, but unlikely, profit off my influence, network, and net worth. We're raised in a system where being rich is the desirable quality, not just because there's even less resources available to us all, and thus money is necessary for survival, also because being rich is now a personality trait that's supposed to mean that anything on the other end of your equation doesn't count. Why doesn't it matter how someone got rich? If you scammed your way into it, doesn't that make it not impressive and in fact gross? You cheated. You didn't win. The uppity and shitty Van Laars didn't earn their wealth. Their father did, and they merely find a way to perpetuate it, which isn't impressive. Isn't that the old adage? You have to have money to make money? That's without even mentioning the rigged system. Why are we idolizing these people? They're so gross and also not good at anything other than demeaning other people. They're insecure man babies that are often filthy and don't look after their things and don't understand consideration and gentile and kindness. And they can't seem to think critically. That opinion also comes from a place of privilege, though, because I've always had more guidance and resources available to me than Louise, and thus I've never needed to rely on the sacrificial pipe dream that is a stupid little man boy like John Paul McAllen the 18th or whatever. Judita, Judy for short, enters Self-Reliance and is tasked with interviewing people. She's nervous and not regarded as someone of competence because no one that she's working with, colleagues or otherwise, have ever seen a woman police officer on the job. Initially, Judy interviews Peter too, and he dismisses her, saying he'll speak with the captain whenever he gets here. Judy says, it's actually wiser to get started. In light of your grandson's case, we want to take this as seriously as possible. Peter too, the charmer that he is, refers to Judy as Miss a few times. He insists that the only danger to Barbara is Barbara herself, that she likely ran away and is causing drama because that's what Barbara likes to do. Apparently, the only topic in this household all summer, the last few years, has been about appeasing Barbara and not upsetting Barbara. He says she's acting the way any 13-year-old girl acts, only worse, which is not a particularly flattering view of his granddaughter. Peter two's wife says absolutely nothing the entire time she's interviewing them. Judy, feeling relatively jilted and trying not to show that her confidence has been kind of shaken by this enormous man bully, investigates the rest of the house. That's how she happens upon a room that smells of fresh paint. Tracy, lost in the woods, is sitting there yelling, "I'm lost," growing hungry, terrified, and thirsty. The world around her is blurry and green, and she curses herself for her vanity, for being too proud to wear the glasses she was prescribed this year. Real fear sets in. She starts screaming, crying for her parents, when suddenly she hears footsteps and someone steps into view. And listen, we don't get a semi-resolution for this for at least 20 pages, but I'm going to give it to you now. Because Tracy is not wearing glasses, she can't tell if that figure is a man or a woman. They have gray hair and they gesture for her to follow silently, so she never hears their voice. That person, without ever saying anything, leads her out of the woods. Tracy wonders about Scary Mary, the ghost-like figure seen lingering around the edge of the woods. The problem, says Tracy, is that it really doesn't seem like it was Scary Mary because the figure seemed to walk like a man. We are meant to wonder if Jacob Sluter, convicted serial killer, happened to wander upon Tracy in the woods and then lead her back to camp that is crawling with police officers and investigators. And I think that's supposed to tell us something about him. Once the stranger walks Tracy back to camp, they point silently at Self-Reliance and then is re-enfolded into the foliage. Tracy's back! Let me update you on our other main perspectives. Alice, the mother of a missing child, has a towel placed around her shoulders and has taken several more sedatives. She is silently sitting on an Adirondack chair overlooking the lake. She tells us that Barbara has always been difficult. Apparently, being neglected impacted the child enormously. Can you imagine? She would have enormous tantrums that no amount of yelling, screaming, scolding, or slapping could quell. Peter III, the adult man, used to try slapping toddler Barbara to get her to stop crying. Isn't that so shocking that being hit by the adult man did not help with the dysregulation of the child? That's so weird. It's obviously on Barbara. Alice and Peter, a few months prior, were called to the boarding school where Barbara now lives. Though she had no problems there the first few semesters, now they're being called in for some sort of disciplinary meeting. Susan Yoder, someone Alice presumes to be a progressive lesbian, is the formidable head of the Emily Grange school. Peter III is incensed that he has to go all the way to the school. He says, "You'd think with the money we pay, we wouldn't even have to feign care for our child, that they would just do the parenting for us." Those aren't the words he uses. The words he uses are, "For the amount we pay them, one would think this person might understand what an imposition it is to ask a man to take time out of his day." The implication is absolutely that Susan Yoder, a woman who runs a goddamn school, doesn't understand the busy and very important schedule of banking men like Peter Van Laar III. Anyway, they're called up to the school and it's revealed that Barbara was caught with a boy in her room. Peter III, his first question, this is so creepy. He's like, "In what state?" "Excuse me? In what state was my daughter found?" He wants to hear that she was unclothed. He's asking if his daughter was in a state of undress. His daughter is 13 years old. He is her father. Miss Yoder says, "Oh, they were clothed and all that." She seems to be saying like, kids. Like she's thinking this is actually not that big of a deal. She says we can't assume that anything happened because no other adults were in the room, but the head of Barbara's dorm saw someone sneaking out of her window and Barbara said it was a boy from town. Peter says, "Who's responsible for this oversight? Who's responsible for letting a boy into the girls' dorm?" Miss Yoder's like, "Well, Barbara is." They don't know the boy's name or age or anything about him. The dorm head of house saw him exiting through the window. She described him as thin and dark-haired. Peter III, who for some reason thinks it's really important to come from a line of people that have one boy and one boy only, becomes very distressed by the potential for his daughter to become pregnant and thus ruin his family's industry because banking is about trust. He becomes so preoccupied with the idea of his prepubescent daughter becoming pregnant that he decides he's going to send her to a sort of disciplinary reform school for children with disciplinary issues. It's a behavior modification program. It's like, can you do anything yourself? Like, just parent your child. And like, obviously, as a person that loves the character Barbara, I don't want her father to attempt to parent her in any way, shape, or form because I don't think he would do a good job. But it's just interesting. It's an interesting commentary that you think you can hire out a father. The fact that they cannot see this as the problem is just a reflection of how blind, delusional, or unwilling to acknowledge anything real or hard that the wealthy seem to be. That love and parentage is not something you can delegate. It's clear to me, as a lover of humans and a former student of psychology, that Barbara and her makeup and her rip tights and music taste are entirely the product of her parents' actions and not at all the problem that her shallow and weak-minded parents believe it to be. Having finished the book, we can honestly feel a sort of gratitude that neither of these adult humans bothered to attempt to raise, let alone attempt to love and understand the soul they ripped from the cosmos and forced into a skin life on Earth under the name Barbara Van Laar. Anyway, rest assured, though they have decided that the Barbara will attend this disciplinary school, it's fallen on Alice's shoulders to impart that information to her, and she has not done so yet. Alice tells us, after a series of bargains that she makes with herself, that she'll just tell Barbara on the way to that disciplinary school. Barbara will think she's headed toward Emily Grange, and when she's already in the car, she won't be able to leave. That's so scary. So, the case can definitely be argued that Alice starts as a victim. In that case, we're arguing that a woman of extreme privilege, in a time when all women are even more marginalized than they are right now, we're arguing that a white woman with that extreme privilege is a victim of her time and community because she is never granted personhood in a way that women born into less resources are. And I don't love that. That being said, being a victim, even if we decide that that's what she is, because while she has no power in her home, she has more power than all the other women that we meet in this book. It definitely doesn't erase the damage she does or prevent her from imparting damage on another. I have not yet expounded upon all that took place with Bear. So we know that Alice's trauma is compounding on itself, and at this point in the book, we're not exactly sure what that trauma is or why it has impacted her in the way that it has. But I don't think we can forgive her for never loving Barbara. She says she tried to love the new baby. She much prefers following, calling after Bear in a dreamland to the reality of her situation. And Barbara exists in this reality. I am not a parent, but this book is full of parallels. And I think Carl and Marianne Stoddard, two people that tragically and traumatically lost a child, finding a way to persevere and to not blame their other children for surviving, for not being the child that they lost, while having to sojourn through economic turmoil, just proves that it's possible with less. Alice tells us that she hadn't actually wanted to get pregnant so quickly after Bear's disappearance, but Peter insisted that they weren't getting any younger, and now she'd have something to do. So that makes consent around Barbara's conception and pretty much all sexual contact between these two married people murky. We have insight into Barbara's birth, which Alice describes as unbearable. While in labor, she hallucinates a young bear in the room calling to her, and when she confides this in Peter, he is absolutely unbothered and unconcerned. Alice says she thinks that this hallucination while she was in labor is a sign that Bear is still out there and that they should be looking for him, and Peter seems to dismiss this information out of hand, and I think we as the reader are supposed to find this a little bit suspicious because it implies that he thinks that maybe Bear isn't out there. And if he doesn't think Bear is out there, where does he think Bear is? It's actually Peter 3 that comes up with the name Barbara. He says he's partial to that name, and though he's never brought up this name before, and it wasn't any of the names that the two of them discussed, Alice says that all of the baby books say that any interest that your husband demonstrates in the kids should be rewarded, so she lets him name her Barbara. And later, she looks up what the name Barbara means. The word originates from barbarian, which means wild and strange. And Alice is horrified. She's like, does everyone know this is what Barbara means? And I think it's Liz Moore, again, very subtly commenting, like Barbie, TM, made her official debut in 1959. So this is like 2 years before Barbara is born. So this is the most popular and most common name of the time. That's my understanding. And now colloquially, obviously, to call someone a Barbie is to call someone generic or basic or stupid. So it means the opposite of the uncommon, wild, strange, barbarian fighter that Alice interprets the name to be. It's just kind of cool. It's just funny. It's good writing. It's just a book that keeps on goddamn giving. Alice, on the day that Barbara has been missing for just a few hours, asks her husband Peter if the police captain will want to speak to her. And he says, no, you're too tired. You've retired to your room. And she says, okay, and she retires to her room. He says, go on, I'll help you up to the house. She decides she'll take 2 pills today, like she's allowed on very bad days, when she reaches Self-Reliance. Louise, on the other hand, is being questioned by Denny Hayes. He remembers Louise from when he dated her mom. We come to excuse Danny of his microaggressions toward Judy because he does seem to reveal himself as an ally of sorts, or at least like her least misogynistic coworker. He's often encouraging her to pursue leads and crediting her with the work, which she does literally all the work on this entire investigation. Without Judy in this book, nothing moves forward, which I think is the point. And it also really brings into perspective, like for our generation, can you believe that there were no women in this workforce, that all police investigations fell to men? Like, imagine just for a second that there are no women investigating your murder. Bleak. Anyway, so he endears us to him by sharing a few things. Now he has a wife and several children. He only smokes in the car. And when he used to date Louise's mom, he took her and Louise on an outing to some sort of carnival. And Louise says this is one of the only happy memories she actually has with her mom. He says he bought her an ice cream cone and it fell, and he immediately bought her another one just to get the look off of her face. He seems really well-meaning despite the way that the time and the system that he grew up in has stunted him. He doesn't seem to be deliberately shitty, which separates him in this crowd of people. So Louise doesn't immediately recognize Denny, but she does remember the day. Denny says he's heard a lot of things about Louise in the years since, and he says, but he's never believed any of them. The things that he has heard are not that she was the salutatorian of her high school or that she went to college on a full ride. The things he's heard are about who she slept with, which I don't really think is that notable of a number. Anyway, so Denny asks her to think through her story and tells her that it's really important that it matches Annabelle's, the counselor in training. Big shock, 17-year-old rich ballerina Annabelle has immediately ratted on Louise, and more than ratting on Louise and not getting rid of the bag, she's added her own powdered substances to the bag and is now blaming it on Louise. And you'll probably guess who the cops believe. Denny charges Louise with possession of a controlled substance and tells her that he's not supposed to do this, but really she should ask for a lawyer. She says, I already have a lawyer, because guess whose daddy is a big fancy bake lawyer? That's right, John Paul Jr. has a John Paul Sr. And Louise thinks, okay, well, I'm his fiance. We've been together for 4 years. Surely he'll help me. She heads up to the big house with Denny trailing her and thinks she's owed this. And she obviously is. But anyway, she's faced with John Paul Sr. and he immediately goes on offense, as the rich are wont to do. Are you the reason he's gone? She says, no, I didn't know he was gone. I'm here to talk to him. Last night, he threatened her. He says, do you know what this looks like? With her gone and him gone? Barbara and John Paul would have been raised like cousins. She is 13 and he is 25. Louise thinks she does. She does know what this looks like. Only then does John Paul Sr. acknowledge or notice Denny Hayes behind her. And he says, are they taking you in for something? And she says, drugs, but they weren't mine. And he says, best of luck, and lets the door slam in her face. And this part of the book is so like, I feel this in my chest. So Denny Hayes takes Louise in on drugs charges, and she sits in a holding cell for basically the rest of this book. The police seem to be working a theory that she, the counselor that was supposed to be responsible for Barbara, is somehow complicit in her disappearance because her fiance is now missing. So Louise is taken hours away and kept in a holding cell. She is literally innocent of everything, and she just sits there being neglected and wasting days of her precious life. She gets one phone call, and so she calls her mom's home, and who answers but 11-year-old Jesse, and he tells her that he's hungry. And so she spends that phone call telling him to go to the grocery store, telling him what to buy, and telling him to put it on her tab, not mom's. And he says okay. And that's all the help that she's gonna get. Back to Judy. Judy is met by one of the actresses that Barbara and Alice have both separately acknowledged are the entertainment for the party. The actress says that last night, John Paul Jr. came back and his face was all beaten up. Seemed he'd been in an altercation and he looked pretty intoxicated. She tells Judy that he's missing now and that he drives a blue Trans Am. She says she remembers it because she was in it. So just in case there's any part of you that was kind of mad at Louise or betrayed on John Paul's half that Louise went out to maybe fuck around with Lee Townsend, who's been in a 4-year faux relationship with abusive, alcoholic, degenerate rich kid John Paul, obviously, he is also stepping out on her too. And we have evidence of in one way of that here. Back in 1961, when Carl Stoddard regains consciousness, he's in the back of his friend's pickup truck. He dissuades his friends from taking him to any sort of hospital care because he simply cannot afford it. He goes to the family doctor, who really does insist that he seek emergent care. Couldn't I call someone, make an appointment? I'm not in any pain. He is, in fact, in pain. My internalized misogyny never shows itself as much as when a man that I perceive to be kind and gentle is sacrificing himself. I infantilize the shit out of them. I am in love with Carl Stoddard. I love when a man is hurting and being tough about it. I love it. Which is funny because most books are about women hurting and being tough about it. Let me hold you. Okay. But if Carl is unwilling, because the doctor is aware of the family's situation and the hospital bills that still have yet to be paid, he must go home and rest, and he must at all costs avoid any activity that would elevate his heart rate. Carl has to stay home, but he insists that Marianne, his wife, continue searching for Bear. She says, Carl, how well did you know that boy? Carl says he liked the outdoors, used to come around and ask about plants. Once he taught him how to build a fire. She says, well, they found something. A little carved bear, buried in some underbrush. Do you think that's strange? He says, not really. I taught him how to whittle. The hounds that they brought him for the search are useless because of the rain. The search is going to definitely go on, but this is the only evidence that anyone has found of Bear, who has ultimately otherwise disappeared without a trace, and it looks like someone buried it. Without any proper leads, this carving becomes essential to the state's case against Carl Stoddard, who folks say took an obsessive interest in the boy. After days of searching, the talk is that maybe the boy just wandered off out of anger or curiosity, maybe got lost or injured, and succumbed to the cold in the night. Bear is presumed dead. There's a rumor that Carl was the last person to see Bear alive, and then there's this carving. Carl confides in Marianne that he believes that Bear was actually afraid of his grandfather, and Marianne cries because she believes him and she thinks that no one else will. Carl's friends knock on the door in the middle of the night, saying that the police are coming in the morning. They say that they're so sorry. They say he should run for the hills. The history teacher, Bob Alcott, says all their evidence is circumstantial and it would never hold up in a court of law. But it never gets the opportunity because in the morning, the police come, they arrest Carl, and he has a heart attack in a holding cell. He dies. The assumed murderer of Bear Van Laar. Alice tells us that when Bear went missing, Peter 2 and 3 had her parents chaperone her and drop her off at a mental institution called the Dunwoody Institute. It's run by a friend of a friend. That alleged healthcare professional insists that the Van Laars, while Alice is basically imprisoned in this institute, rid all their homes of any trace of Bear Van Laar, so that when Alice comes back, she'll have to... whatever. Okay. So she is ultimately held captive in this enormous, brutalist gray building, being sedated and reprogrammed to pretend that her son never existed. She is not visited or called by anyone other than her sister Delphine, whom she refuses to see. Found. Tracy, in August of 1975, sits with a sandwich and a water and is being interviewed by the first woman police officer she's ever seen, let alone met. Judy asks Tracy if she can tell her any identifying information about the person that led her out of the woods. Tracy says no, but then Tracy tells Judy about Barbara and the older boyfriend she was sneaking out of Balsam to meet every single night. She also tells Judy that Barbara was relatively unconnected to her parents, or that her parents were uninvolved in Barbara's life. Judy says, "Can you think of any reason why Barbara might have been upset or wanted to run away?" Tracy says, "Not really, but she was pissed because they painted her walls." Judy is walking with Denny Hayes back to the command post, which is really just TJ Hewitt's director's cabin that has been repurposed to be command throughout the investigation. So TJ Hewitt has been displaced. They've basically just kicked her out. Judy tells Hayes that she put out a bolo, which is a be on the lookout for John Paul's blue Trans Am. He tells her to speak up in command because she's actually doing really great work here. Captain Captain La Rochelle, I don't know, who headed Bungled, the Bear Van Laar investigation, is leading in command. There's a list of their persons of interest, which are John Paul Jr., Louise Donahue, and the unknown person in the woods. Someone asks if there's any reason to suspect the parents. Is it weird that they wouldn't talk to any of us and insisted on talking only to the captain? The captain says, "Hey, not really. Keep a close eye out, but it makes sense that they'd be comfortable with me given that we worked together 14 years ago." But like most people in promotional positions, Captain La Rochelle, I'm going to call him Captain Roach. Captain Roach has been managing investigations for the last decade, not leading them. So he's actually less equipped than his underlings to run the search. So he's not actually that qualified for this job that the Van Laars have insisted he take. Judy speaks up about the new older boyfriend information, which means literally all the information that this entire investigation is running on has come from Judy. It's delegated to someone who's not Judy to investigate Barbara's room further. Someone asked the captain if it's worth considering Jacob Sluter, and he laughs them off. He's really sarcastic. He's like, "Let's see about that." It's always a good sign when your leadership bristles at questions. Convicted sexual offender finds young girl lost in the woods and decides to lead her back to a police investigation. I'm just saying, when you hear hoofbeats, don't think zebra. That's who I'd want investigating my murder, that's for sure. An in-the-box thinker. Something else is that Judy is 26 and unmarried, and as is apparently normal for the time, that means she still lives with her family. She has commuted 2 hours to be on the investigation site today, and she will commute 2 hours home and then have to commute 2 hours again in the morning, and eventually this becomes super unsustainable. In a few days, Judy will be driving home and actually fall asleep at the wheel. She'll wake up grateful to realize that she had the wherewithal to pull over and sleep on the side of the street, but this leads to her staying in a motel in the town of Shattuck. She lets her parents know, begging her mother to tell her father that she's staying with a friend, and actually, one night of the investigation, Judy's father shows up and tells her, "Get in the car, we're going home," like she's a child and not an investigator police officer who've received a promotion. She has a moment where she has to say to her father, who she loves and respects enormously, that he is wrong about what is best for her in this moment. He emotionally blackmails her and says, "Your mother has been crying," and he believes that that's improper and inappropriate and shameful, and he lets her know all of that information, and then he gets back in the car and he drives home alone. It just goes to show that you can have good parents that have ideas about what is best for you, and they can also do things wrong. John Paul and his Trans Am are located soon within the investigation, and he actually would have been pulled over regardless because he was driving so erratically, and he's obviously so clearly intoxicated. They find numerous unhidden illicit substances in his car, and when asked to step out of his vehicle, he invokes the right against self-incrimination. incrimination. Spoken like the son of a lawyer. His first phone call is to his daddy, as Judy knew it would be. Dad? Also found in John Paul's car is Barbara Van Laar's bloody camp uniform in a brown bag. John Paul Jr. and John Paul Sr. accuse Louise of murdering Barbara and telling John Paul to get rid of this bag. What? This bag reminds the police of Louise's other bag that she told someone else to get rid of. The bag of Annabelle's vomit. When this is brought up to Louise in questioning, she feels absolutely sick. The last of the John Paul delusion trickles down the drain. The police officer says, maybe you were jealous. Barbara looked older. And she says, Barbara did not look older. Barbara looked like a 13-year-old girl wearing eyeliner. Barbara looked like a kid. I was not jealous of Barbara. She is shocked that John Paul could do something this evil and that he would blame her for it. And she is terrified that they will believe him. She thinks of the time that he beat her up, how she barely managed to flee. She ended up in Balsam, actually, trying to light a fire in the decrepit old chimney when TJ finds her. And Louise has a black eye, her spine is injured, she's really beat up. And TJ lets her sleep in her cabin for about a week. We learn a lot about TJ at that point in time, that Vic is still alive and basically infirm, and TJ takes on all of his responsibilities of feeding him, caring for him, clothing him, bathing him, and TJ shares her future aspirations. Her family has a cabin, an island actually, way up north that she hopes to retire to and to live at. She's just waiting on money. Louise spends a week in TJ's cabin, reading her books and chatting with her at night. Every evening, TJ has exactly 1/4 tumbler of rye whiskey, and Louise thinks this is so cool and so adult that she decides that she will definitely adopt this habit when she's older. At one point in time, Louise actually comes on to TJ, and TJ seems to be into it, but then she reminds herself, or both of them, that she is her employer. So TJ responsibly shuts the whole thing down. TJ never speaks of the transgression again. Louise spends the rest of the week there, letting her face heal, and eventually she goes back to the lodge she was working at. When she gets back to that lodge, there's a note, a handwritten note from John Paul, apologizing, says he hasn't had a drink since that night. His mother would be so ashamed of him. Please, can he make it up to her? How can he apologize? Whatever. And eventually he shows up at her place of work and has the audacity to ask if they can speak privately, and Louise is like, no. And they sit there, he apologizes, and then he says everything that she wants to hear. That they're engaged, that they'll get married, that they'll buy the big house with the 4 bedrooms and the 2 kids, and they'll move Jesse in, and he'll have the life that he always deserved. And it's so spot on. Louise actually wonders if he read her diary. He doesn't usually seem to be listening when she talks. She tells him he'll think about it, and he leaves her with a bag of groceries because he's sweet, I guess. And those groceries, though, are far too fancy and complicated for Louise to do a ton with. It's like a T-bone steak and some shrimps and some oranges, a bundt cake. So she takes those groceries to her mother's house, and she finds her 11-year-old brother smoking pot. She makes him the shrimp and the steak, and they feast together in what must be the best meal of the 11-year-old's life. And it's pretty clear through subtext that Jesse understands that Louise is being mistreated and abused by John Paul and does not want her to be with him. And it's frustrating because the reason that she is with him is, according to her, for Jesse. It's a sacrifice that Jesse clearly doesn't want her to make, because Jesse can tell that she's being battered and abused by the person who's supposed to love and protect her. When they finish that meal, she tells Jesse no more pot. She can tell she's lost all authority with him. It's August 1975, day 2 of Barbara being missing, and Judy gets to command an hour before everyone else on account of her having commuted. Overnight, command has been reorganized, and the most notable changes are someone has dragged in a large filing cabinet full of Bear Van Laar's case files, and someone has drawn a line down the middle of an empty chalkboard, and on one side of that line reads Bear and the other side reads Barbara. Judy spends the next hour of her life entrenched in those case files. When the captain walks in on time, he looks at the board. Who did this? When no one fesses up, he says, well, don't do it again. Bear's case is closed. Their prime suspect, John Paul, is out on bail, of course, awaiting his hearing for driving under the influence. Louise Donahue is still in a holding cell, and John Paul claims she's the one that gave him the bag of bloody clothes. Lee Townsend, who is also a person of interest for some reason, has not been located. The police have found Barbara's sketchbook, and inside of that sketchbook is a depiction of her room at Self-Reliance, and in that depiction of her room, she has drawn the mural that she had painted on her wall, which leads the police to believe, on top of the fresh paint smell, that the Van Laars have covered something up in their daughter's room. So they hire some sort of expert who's going to take off the fresh layer of paint. Judy and Denny Hayes are walking towards Self-Reliance clients from the director's cabin, and Judy says, how did JP get out on bail? And he says, how do you think? Hayes goes on to tell Judy that he was the one that pulled the files on Bear, and he's the one that wrote that on the board. He says everyone in the room is thinking the same thing except for the captain. Hayes says Captain Roach is defensive because Bear's case was a career-making case for him? What? They didn't even do anything! Whatever. He's the one that had the Stoddard theory. The family bought it and pushed it forward. Hayes says they're a strange family. Too many generations with too much money. Addles the brain. Judy is walking up to the main house. After having been tasked with making a map of the house and the grounds, which feels particularly administrative, which I have to believe is gendered, when she is met by a small woman in an apron holding a flowered rolling pin. She asks Judy if she's a police officer. When they're alone, she tells Judy that her name is Jeannie Clute and that she's a temporary cook for the week. Jeannie has 3 children, a 4th on the way. She says she took this job, but she definitely shouldn't. It was foolish because these are bad people, but desperate times call for desperate measures. They let the wrong man take the fall when their son disappeared. They let his name be ruined. Jeannie Clute reveals that Clute is her married name and that her father was Carl Stoddard. And she reveals that the Van Lairs have no clue that they have hired her. She says, I don't know where Barbara's gone, but I bet her family does. She says she's speaking out of turn, but when Bear went missing, they bungled it so bad it honestly seemed like they didn't want to find Bear. When no trace of the boy was found, the boy was presumed dead, and with Carl deceased, he took the fall. She says, if you had children, would you have stopped looking as early as they did? Would you ever? She says no one in the family likes that little girl. Neglected is what I'd call it. Lost looking in her own house. I would feed her whenever I could, but her mother didn't like it. Barbara's odd, but she's a good soul, I think. Took the time to learn my name. Judy says, Mrs. Clute, this is very helpful. This is great information. Any chance I could get a statement? And she says, hell no, absolutely not. And dips. Judy is making a map of the grounds and she gets to an old building that used to be a slaughterhouse. Just as she steps inside, she hears footsteps, and all of her training commands her to call for backup before she investigates those footsteps. And because it's 1975, she doesn't have any way to call for backup, so she has to go get backup, which takes about 15 minutes. And by the time everyone is surrounded by this old slaughterhouse, they burst into the place. There is nobody inside of there. And Judy, who already feels nervous every time she pipes up because she recognizes she's speaking on behalf of all women, and she is constantly being evaluated as to whether or not women are cut out for investigatory work because there was no one inside of the slaughterhouse, and the whole team gathered around the slaughterhouse thinking that they were about to apprehend, I don't know, maybe Jacob Sluter or find Barbara Van Laar, whatever, because it's just empty. She's regarded as a hysterical woman that made something out of nothing. She's teased for it. But this will come up later. And it does change the way she speaks up in the investigation. Let's talk about July 1975, survival trip. So survival trip is never announced in advance. It's sprung upon the campers at 5:30 a.m. by an air horn sounding. All summer they've been coached. When the horn sounds, they would leap out of their beds and into their clothes, no showers, and run straight to their designated flagpole. The first people at the flagpole would get the backpacks with the most provisions, and the last people there would get backpacks with nothing in them at all. Barbara was up and dressed before anyone else, probably because she knew when survival trip was happening, and she gives Tracy the tip that she should put warm clothes on over her camp uniform. Tracy is almost the last to the flagpole, and when she gets there, Lowell and Barbara are like counting out their provisions. They've taken charge. They're the team. TJ arrives and says, you're with me. Let's go. And TJ walks them up to a sort of clearing that will be their campsite and then kind of disappears around a few trees. Don't look at me. I'm invisible. I'm not here. Like, I just freaking love TJ. She walks away, and in the campers, a group of 12 kids, ranges from age 8 to 14, set up their 4 tents. Barbara and Tracy share one. Lowell and his best friend Walter share one. And then there are 4 younger kids and 2 tents. Tracy marvels at the way that Barbara moves. She seems a lot older than the rest of them in a lot of ways. They end up sharing their provisions over the fire. The youngest kid at the entire camp, Christopher, was not tipped off about the bringing warm clothes, and so Barbara takes off her sweatshirt and she gives it to him. They tell ghost stories around the fire, and they take care of each other. It feels like they are in an adultless enclosure. After the young ones go to bed, Tracy, Lowell, Barbara, and Walter all stay up in the boys' tent, talking and playing Truth or Dare. The first time in Tracy's life, she is hanging out with friends. It's so well written. It feels so real. I can't recommend this book enough. There's an interesting line where Tracy is trying to decide what the right truth to give Walter is. She's trying to play the game correctly, and Liz Moore does a really good job contextualizing the way that there is a right way to socially behave in these situations, and one can do it wrong on accident in 1,000 different ways. Like, she recognizes that she's done something wrong and unkind and entirely on accident. They're drinking creme de menthe out of Walter's father's flask. Tracy dares Barbara to tell them the name of her boyfriend, and Barbara ends up drinking a lot from the flask and saying, "The truth is I can't tell you." Then Barbara dares Lowell, the boy that Tracy has an enormous camp crush on, to kiss her. And when they kiss, it becomes very clear to Tracy that there is desire on Lowell's part as it relates to this kiss. She's betrayed her friend's secret in front of the boys, and Barbara has retaliated in the way that sometimes young girls do. At the base of her neck, Tracy recognizes the cold sensation of fear, and she chastises herself. She doesn't look away. She watches the whole thing, and she thinks, "I deserve this for letting my guard down." So sad. The evening wraps up quickly after that, and Barbara and Tracy go back to their tent. Tracy is crying, and Barbara wraps her arms around her and says, "I'm sorry. Sometimes I just think of the worst thing that I could do in that moment, and I do it." And Tracy says, "You should have that examined." And Barbara says, "I have. I've been seeing a new psychiatrist every year since I was 5 years old." She says, "At least now, my current one, Dr. Roth, is a woman. And Dr. Roth says I have impulse control." And her father agrees. Tracy asks about her mother. Barbara says she's useless. She barely functions. "My brother went missing and he never came back, and neither did she." She says, "Did you know that about my brother? Does everyone? My mom thinks he'll come back, but that's a secret from my father. He gets mad when Bear is even mentioned." And I think when we're reading this book, we're supposed to be a little bit suspicious of Peter 2 and Peter 3 as potential murderers of their son. Barbara says she wishes that Bear had never disappeared, and sometimes she has conversations in her mind with him. She also says if he hadn't disappeared, Barbara wouldn't have been born, and maybe that would have been better. And Tracy, at 13 years old, does not register this statement as a cry for help, but rather a statement of fact. And the two of them just lay there and breathe together for a long time. And then eventually, Barbara gets up, says, "Okay, I have to go. It's my time to leave." She's going to meet her older boyfriend. And Tracy's like, "You're going tonight too?" And she's like, "Yep, don't worry about me. I know every inch of these woods." And she gets up and she goes. And the next morning, Barbara's back with kindling. And the campers are having a hard time catching squirrels with their snares. But at one point in time, Barbara wanders off and comes back with a snare that is full of squirrels. And one of them is still twitching. And in this sort of like rite of passage test, Tracy has to mercy kill the squirrel. TJ looks on and seems to approve. I think TJ snared those squirrels, obviously. While skinning the squirrel, Barbara accidentally impales herself with her knife on her thigh, and she immediately removes the knife and says, "I shouldn't have done that. Definitely shouldn't have done that." Barbara asks for her sweatshirt back. She ties a sort of tourniquet, insists that she doesn't need any adult help. The other campers are starting to freak out because they're like, "Barbara, we really should just go tell TJ." She's fading fast. She's entirely pale. And eventually, after several hours, Lowell makes the executive decision to tell TJ, and TJ comes back immediately, grabs Barbara, and races her back to her tent. Barbara, later that night, is delivered to them, sutured, in warmer clothes, well-fed, well-watered, and totally okay. As they're lying in bed that night, Barbara scoffs and says she would have been fine. She didn't need adult intervention, but she obviously did. And Tracy asks if she's leaving tonight, and she says, "No, probably not. My leg won't let me." Tracy says, "Is that all right that you're not going?" Barbara says, "Probably not. It's probably not all right." Now we get information from Alice in 1961. Alice tells us she hasn't had much to drink at what would be the last Flack Fly goodbye in 1961. Because everything was going so well, she didn't feel she really needed to drink. But Delphine's questioning had soured Peter's mood. By 4 o'clock, the rain is coming. Everyone can smell it in the air. The celebratory, "let's all stay for another day," has sort of worn off, and everyone's thinking, actually, today feels like the last day. Someone proposed one last outing on Lake Joan, and Alice thinks Bear would like that. And so she's wandering around her house looking for Bear. She has never paid so little attention as she did that week. What with the Peter distraction, and he was always running off on some new adventure with so many friends around. She can't find him in his room and any of the McLeland's rooms. She looks down the beach and in the boathouse. She saved Peter's room for last. She thought it unlikely her son was in there, but Bear and his father had become closer lately. She stands outside Peter's door and listens. She turns the knob, and in her husband's bed, she finds her husband and her sister naked, sleeping, entwined, wrapped up in one another. They are comfortable and fast asleep, cuddling in a way that the two of them literally never have. She thinks of all of his disdain for Delphine, clearly feigned, saying the opposite of what he means. Judy, in present day, is back in command and asks Hayes for an update. The only new info is that the campers have reported an old ghost woman that they call Scary Mary, who they sometimes seen lingering around the property. Everyone's like, cool. Judy shares the information she learned from Carl Stoddard's daughter, that everyone thinks Carl was framed and that the family didn't like Barbara. A tip comes in that John Paul wasn't actually traveling the way he told Louise. He was actually staying in the area all summer, making it probable that he could be the older boyfriend that Tracy disclosed to Judy. So they think between that and the bloody uniform, John Paul is probably our guy. The one snag is John Paul and his very rich lawyer father are pointing at Louise. On day 3 of the investigation, Judy wakes up to a knock on her door at 6 a.m. It's Bob Alcott, former history teacher and volunteer fire department, and also the owner of this motel. He tells her that he has some information investigation, not about this investigation, but about the one 14 years prior, about Bear. Louise, meanwhile, is sitting even further upstate New York when she hears that her bail has been posted. She finds herself in a car with Denny Hayes, being released back to her mom's house, even though she's loath to return there, but it's her only known address on file, so that's where the police insist that she go. When she gets there, Louise is semi-excited because she has no idea who has bailed her out, and the only person she can suspect is her mother, which must mean that she's lucid and coherent enough and has enough cash to have done so. Denny takes Louise inside and greets her mom. He's kind to her mother, and when she asks what Louise has done, he says, on the count of the fact that she's 18, I'll let her tell you that, right? Like, Denny just doesn't do anything that is deliberately bad and seems to be doing his job to the description, and I appreciate that. And it's a bummer that the bar's that low, but that makes me like him. Then Denny speaks to Louise privately and tells her that the police are looking for Lee Townsend because he has a record, and his record is for the statutory assault of a 16-year-old girl when he himself was 18 years old. And John Paul is saying that the two of you, Lee and Louise, killed Barbara. Tracy, meanwhile, has been picked up by Donna Romano, not her dad, by Donna Romano, and taken back to her family's rental in Saratoga Springs, which is where she had wanted to spend her entire summer. But now that she's back, she finds that it's actually a relatively lame consolation prize compared to the camp summer that she'd just been having. For an hour, despite the fact that she has set up her environment the way she wants it to be, and she's prepared all these elaborate snacks, her book goes unread. She's thinking about Barbara Van Laar and scanning her brain for evidence that might bring her home. She's remembering how a few days before a survival trip, Barbara and her snuck into Self-Reliance. This is not something that Tracy wanted to do, but Barbara insisted and she followed her. Barbara was like, don't worry, it's cocktail hour. Everyone's drunk. The only people we have to avoid are the staff. They go into the kitchen and they make a snack, and then eventually they're wandering through the house and they hear someone coming, so Barbara shoves Tracy into a supply closet of some kind. Then Barbara pulls Tracy out of the closet and she is fuming. She is super pissed because she has just seen that her parents painted over her mural. She's like, they wouldn't recognize real art if it bit them in the ass. She's really upset. She also has with her a brown bag. And in all the commotion of the room painting and the sneaking out of the house, Tracy forgets to ask about it until they're back at their bunks that night. When Tracy says, Barbara, what was in the bag? Barbara says, what bag? The night before Barbara went missing was the Camp Emerson dance. And the camp dance is a really big deal. All the girls spent the entire day getting ready for it. Barbara was the resident makeup artist to them all. Tracy is at the dance and she's mooning over Lowell, and she notices that Lowell is mooning over Barbara, and it becomes clear to her that Barbara is who he loves. And so she goes outside to get some air and process her heartbreak when she notices her counselor in training, Annabelle, also leaving the property, walking up toward Self-Reliance. And then she's greeted by Walter, Lowell's best friend, who asks if she's sad too. Turns out Lowell asked Barbara to the dance. Walter tells her this, assuming that she already knows because her and Barbara are best friends, but Barbara did not tell her to spare her from this pain. And it turns out that Walter is also in love with Lowell. He sounds good. The book is a psychological thriller. It's a murder mystery. It's a missing persons case. It's a timepiece because it's in the 70s, and it's camp. While Tracy is thinking about camp, she decides that Barbara Van Laar, powerful and wise, is definitely still out there in the world somewhere. Louise watches her campers at the dance, and I love this so much. She imagines that if there's a God, this is what it feels like, rooting for her charges from afar, mourning alongside them when they were rejected, celebrating every small victory that came their way. She felt in her heart a wild sort of affection for them, wanted to go to them, stand next to them, hold them tightly by her side. She knows that to intervene in this way would disrupt something sacred that they are learning about themselves and the world. She has a game where she counts her campers in her head, and she's counting off all of her campers, and she's able to find everyone except her CIT Annabelle. And listen, while the dance is technically for campers, a lot of the counselors tend to pair off at this time too. So she assumes that that's what's happened to Annabelle. She stepped outside for a few minutes or an hour because maybe Annabelle has also found love, or at least infatuation, at Camp Emerson. We find out that the person that Annabelle, the 17-year-old, has gone to meet is John Paul at Self-Reliance. Guess who her parents want her to advantageously marry? Annabelle tells Louise, who believes she's John Paul's fiance, that she is designated to marry someone that her family has picked out, and it's John Paul. Oh my god, it's so complicated. On day 3, Judy tells Denny Hayes that everyone in Shattuck believes that Bear was not killed by Carl Stoddard. The town has 2 main theories, and the first one is that Jacob Sluter did it. It's the right time period, it's the right area, and he's never never confessed to anything, so it's possible. The second theory is that Bear's grandfather is somehow involved in his disappearance. But the Van Laars had an aggressive attorney that kept pushing the Stoddard angle, and you can guess who that attorney was. John Paul Sr., of course. Denny gives Judy the okay to go interview Peter too, but right before she can do that, an investigator comes in and says, "Are either of you good with kids?" And though he's asking both of them, it's clear he's asking Judy because she's a woman and thus is supposed to be good with kids, but good news for us, Judy's great with kids. Judy has a downright endearing conversation with Christopher, the 8-year-old, the youngest member of the camp. Christopher enlightens Judy that he has a problem that keeps him awake at night, and during survival trip, he saw his friend, Barbara, leaving the camp. She walked out of the tent, walked a few paces in one direction, turned off her flashlight, and then walked in the other direction, right into TJ Hewitt's tent. Christopher says it kept happening every night. Christopher, at 8 years old, already understands, if not the implications of what he's saying, but the intensity or the weight of what he's saying. That it's not okay for young children to go into strange adults' cabins at night. This leads Judy to sort of confront TJ. TJ says she's known Barbara since she was born. She was 14 at the time. TJ would babysit Barbara all summer long. The family would hire her to come up and stay in Albany with Barbara. Judy asks if Barbara was a difficult child, and TJ says, God, no. Her and her brother both. Just nice kids. Judy asks about Barbara's relationship with her parents. TJ basically describes that relationship as non-existent and kind of hostile. TJ says, regardless of all the money they have, they often send Barbara to school with no money, no coat, and no change of clothes. TJ says they either don't remember or they don't care. I don't know which one's worse. She says, I'm the one that comes around. I'm the one that brings her extra food for the weekend, brings her books and records that she likes. I take care of her and no one else does. Judy says, and at night, TJ's eyes zoom up and to the left to a map on the wall behind Judy. She says, Investigator Lovetak, I know what you're implying. I know what people say about me in town. They might even said it to you during your investigation. I dress a certain way. I talk a certain way. Barbara is like a little sister to me. Probably the closest thing I'll ever have to a child of my own. TJ says, I know I'm not obligated to talk to you, and I'm gonna stop now, but woman to woman, John Paul's your guy. Can't tell you how I know that. Just do. Judy walks away from that encounter, unsure how to feel about it, and she ends up, sort of incidentally, sitting next to Mrs. Van Laar Sr., Peter II's wife. She lets it slip that Vic Hewitt is actually still alive and typically lives in the director's cabin, which is now serving as the command post for the investigation, which begs the question, where the heck is Vic Hewitt now? Because TJ didn't mention him in the present tense, seems to be hiding him from the police. This brings us to our final part 5, Self-Reliance. In 1961, after Alice finds her husband and her sister unclothed and wrapped up in each other in a way that she's completely unfamiliar with, she asks herself if she's prepared to walk away from her life. She thinks of all the friends that she knows that have gone through divorces, which aren't a ton, but are a few. She thinks that the men are still around, here even at this gathering, but the wives are gone, completely disappeared from the social circle, and the men always bring back younger models. Alice thinks about losing access to Bear and decides that if she gets to keep all of this and Bear, she can deal with it. She'll ignore it. She'll pretend it never happened. Alice proceeds to drink a lot and cry a lot and drink a lot. Alice goes down into her house where a ring of guests is around the fireplace. No one's outside because the weather has taken a turn. Her words are slurred and her vision is blurry. They seem to recognize that she's drunk and the guests are regarding her with a certain caution. She asks Bear, who's sitting with Tessie Joe and his grandfather, if he'd like to go out on the lake. The weather looks pretty bad now, a boat excursion ill-advised, especially with a person who's extremely drunk and whose faculties don't seem to be intact. Bear's grandfather says, actually, we were just about to go for a walk. So, sorry, Bear's occupied. And Bear is torn between the two of them, feeling responsible for both of their emotions. She says it's one of the things that she loves most about him, the care he has for the way that other people feel. A generous impulse told her to free her son of his new dilemma, having to choose between his mother and his grandfather. But, she says her fatal flaw was that her voice cracked with emotion when she excused him. She's out at the boathouse and she decides she's going to go on the water by herself when the first drops of rain make themselves known. 50 feet from the boathouse, she trips badly. Louise, in present day, on day 3 of the investigation, is at her mother's house when the doorbell rings. And it's a woman with long gray hair. It's actually Marianne Stoddard. She bailed out Louise. She recognized that the Van Laars and their elite ilk were trying to do to Louise what they did to her husband. She won't let them do it again. So she put her house up for collateral for Louise to get her out on bail. And Marianne said she spent her entire life since her husband died combing the Van Laar property for evidence that proves his innocence for any trace of Bear. And Louise deduces that this woman who combs the property property at night with long gray hair may earn the reputation of Scary Mary. You can say it. I've heard they call me that. And thus, one ghost story solved. Lee Townsend also arrives to visit Louise. He explains his statutory assault, says he was sort of framed by the father of the family he'd been working for. He said that situation actually led him to saying he's never going to work for rich folk again, and yet here he is, and yet here he is. He says he's going west to Colorado, and he asks if she wants to come. And she says, well, they know you're going that way, so you should probably go a different way. And she says she doesn't want to come, but she's decided to take what she does want, which is to have sex with Lee Townsend, which she does right here, right now, which good for Louise. I'm happy for her. That's great. Alice, in present day, has been shipped back to Albany. Her daughter is missing on her property, and she has been shipped back to Albany. Not once did she go see her bunk, didn't look on the grounds. Like, they didn't even look. And Alice takes a lot of pills and enters a dream world that we don't really see her resurface from. Let me give you the rundown on Jacob Sluter. Jacob Sluter is apprehended and refuses to speak to anyone unless that person happens to be a woman. And so, of course, Judy is tapped and is willing to participate. She is prepared and told by a former psychologist of Sluter's to not give in to any weakness. Apparently, that's his kink. And the only victim that ever escaped Jacob Sluter is someone he told to beg for mercy, and she refused, and that's why she got away. So she's supposed to present only strength, no weakness, no vulnerability. When she interviews Jacob Sluter, he asks her a series of invasive questions about her virginity and her life, and she handles it really well. And she notices, in fact, that if she can give him certain pieces of vulnerability, she can sort of play Jacob Sluter. But she has an audience of men behind her, and just when it seems like she's getting somewhere, when she's gotten Sluter to admit that he was in the vicinity when Barbara Van Laer went missing, Captain LaRoche barges in and shuts the whole thing down, says it's gotten too inappropriate. Sluter clams back up, and it's not until the next day that LaRoche is forced to let Judy back into this space, and it's actually theorized that he just wanted to claim the win for himself, that he knew that Judy did all the work and Jacob was about to break, and that's why he went in there, which just makes this guy like the shittiest captain. Do your job. Like, why won't anyone do their... Anyway, he tells Judy on the phone that he knows where Bear Van Laer is buried, but he didn't kill him. He says he never told anyone before because he assumed that everyone would think that he killed him, and he didn't have any reason to, but now he wants to use it as leverage. Apparently, the Sluters were the original owners of the land that Peter Van Laer I purchased. The Sluters were loggers, making a fortune off of delogging a very dense land. But then the wilderness became something that was protected, and the Sluters lost their entire logging industry, and with it, any potential fortune. And so they have to sell the land just for them to watch Van Laer build an empire of his own on top of it, which leads the Sluters, they sort of pride themselves on their downtrodden luck. That's how some people got it and others don't. But that's why Sluter keeps getting apprehended in this area, not because he's kidnapping children from the camp, which has never been his MO, but because this, he believes, is his ancestral land. He knows it very well, and he feels called to it. He was hiding out in a cave on the land when someone in 1961 walked by with the body of a boy he later came to identify as Bear Van Laer and buried him nearly in front of his hiding spot. He says he can't remember the details of the man, but that the man was definitely Town. He says he can't tell them where this spot is, but he'll show them. So Judy and the serial killer and a whole horde of investigators all get into canoes and paddle across this lake. They're wondering the whole time if Sluter is just yanking them around, perhaps using this as one last opportunity to see the great outdoors or his land, but in fact, when they do get there, Sluter can lead them to the burial spot of Bear Van Laer. Bones are found and identified to be that of a child around Bear's age, and eventually the dental records were matched. Bear Van Laer has been dead the entire time, and he was buried by someone who looked like they were from town. On day 5, the captain says that Peter III received the news of Bear's body being found stoically. The case will obviously be reopened. And the woman taking the layer of paint off the wall has been working tirelessly because she got so excited, she calls Luptak and Hayes to come see what she's discovered. And what she's discovered are the initials BVL plus JPM, Barbara Van Laer plus John Paul McAllen, thereby confirming for the police that he was in fact her older boyfriend. Hayes says that the initials will hold up as solid evidence with any judge. It is understood that Vic Hewitt led a lot of the investigation and the search for Bear Van Laer, and that makes him kind of a prime suspect in the new reopened Bear Van Laer case, because if you looked at his clothes compared to that of the Van Laers, you'd probably describe him as someone who looks Town. Judy spends a lot of the day looking for either Hewitt. She can no longer locate TJ or Vic. And when she finally does run into TJ, TJ says that her dad is staying with his brother. Judy can't sleep at the motel that night, and she gets up and goes to the vending machine machine where she runs into the owner and operator, history teacher, Bob Alcott. And he shares a lot of information with Judy. He shares everything I've shared with you about the Van Lairs, their complicated history with the Hewitts, and even a little bit about the Sluters. He says that Hewitt sticks around despite Peter II's bullying because rumor has it is that Peter I actually, upon death, bequeathed half the estate to Vic Hewitt and left Self-Reliance to his own son, Peter II. He made a mistake though, because he made Peter II the trustee of the will, and thus Peter II gets to decide whether or not he ever distributes that inheritance to the person it has been bequeathed to. So Vic Hewitt can't get access to the camp that he owns, and he can't sell that land because he doesn't get to technically own it, and Peter II has maliciously decided that he can't have it until he dies. So Vic Hewitt has to wait for Peter II to die to come into his own inheritance. So probably it's TJ that will do the inheriting. And it's really easy to be like, oh yay, Peter I was a conservationist and he just wants to build canoes and is baffled by all these piles of money. But the truth is Peter II and III come out of him, and his son grew up to be horrible and to raise a horrible son. And Peter I has a certain amount of responsibility in this. And I don't think it's an accident that he left Peter II to be the trustee of the will. And he left a family that is obsessed with legacy and ambition. That has to come from somewhere, is all I'm saying. So he's not this like conservationist angel that it's easy to paint him as. And that's a pretty enormous mistake that Peter I made, conveniently resulting in Vic Hewitt being held hostage, not being entitled to the land that he and his family have single-handedly shown these other people how to navigate, that he and his family have operated and maintained and loved and nurtured and cared for several generations. I'm just saying. Anyway, but Bob Alcott also tells Judy that Vic Hewitt's brother died 2 decades ago, which begs the question, where the heck is Vic Hewitt actually staying then? So Judy drives back to the Van Laar Preserve and she goes back to the slaughterhouse because she trusts her intuition and she knows she heard someone up there. Guess who used to live above the apartment in the old slaughterhouse? Charlie. When she goes into the slaughterhouse, she finds that TJ Hewitt has been keeping her infirm father in this apartment while the police occupy her command post. Vic Hewitt is very afraid of Judy and he keeps saying, who? She assures him that she won't hurt him. She had to like break down the door to get in. In his confused state, Vic tells Judy that he didn't kill Bear, only help. TJ Hewitt shows up and eventually all 3 of them end up in a police car on their way back to the station. Now we get Vic Hewitt's account of July 10th, 1961. Vic was speaking with a recalcitrant camper when all of a sudden he looked out his window and saw an overturned canoe on the lake. This leads him to run out there and attempt to help, and he finds Peter II, nominally his brother, but ultimately his enemy. Peter II's entire face is trembling slightly. Vic hears what he thinks is a fox screaming, but then he realizes that foxes are nocturnal and actually this is a woman wailing. The 2 men are at the boathouse. They've locked Alice above the slaughterhouse. Apparently the way things played out, Bear went to his mother's aid to help her take a boat out. I guess the 2 of them did, and then it started raining so much that the canoe actually filled with water. They used their hands to try to get the water out, but eventually it tipped. Alice made it back to shore, but Bear had his clothes caught on the canoe and thus drowned. Peter II swam out and found him and pulled him back ashore. Vic wants to ask if he did CPR, if he did everything he could, but now between the 2 of them is the body of the 8-year-old boy that is the pride and joy of this entire family. And all Peter II can think about is how they're going to cover it up. He has no intention of calling the police, and it is entirely about damage control. Vic says he has 2 choices in front of him. The first, he can keep his integrity intact. He can say that he won't go along with this and that he will call the police. But ultimately, it will mean that he loses his inheritance. And that's not necessarily a problem for him, but who it might be a problem for, he thinks, is his daughter, who people have already started to talk about, who already gets weird looks in town. His daughter, who he doesn't want to subject to the life that Alice Van Laar has been born and bred for. He wants to be able to give her enough money so that she is never forced to marry, never has to worry about resources, never has to compromise who she is. So the second path he sees before him is he can lie and he can help and he can be a person that he no longer respects, but at least he'll be doing right by his daughter. At least that's what he tells himself. And so he says, how can I help? Peter II says, do what you must. Like a fucking coward. So he helps the Van Lairs carry out their wishes and he buries their boy and the story. So it's Vic Hewitt that Sluter sees gently burying the body of the 8-year-old boy. TJ happens to see this too, despite the fact that Vic had planned to keep this a secret from her until she was old enough to understand. She has overheard her father consent to be complicit in the death of her only friend, her best friend, and thus she carries this knowledge with her from the age of 12. TJ and Vic sign a statement with the police, and Vic won't serve prison time because of his condition condition, and Carl Stoddard's name is officially cleared. And so the only question left to ask is, where is Barbara Van Laar? Judy says given all the evidence, she has to assume that it's John Paul, but something isn't sitting right with her. Over and over again, she goes over all the pieces of the puzzle and she says something just does not fit. Louise and Judy both end up at the same small town diner, and they end up talking. Louise clears TJ's name, says you don't have to worry about her. She's literally harmless. Like, she wouldn't hurt a fly. She's actually the best. She just needs money before she can flee to her family's cabin, the island. Though John Paul Jr. won't be charged with Barbara's death, he will be charged with second-degree aggravated assault, and the victim coming forward is Louise Donahue. Annabelle's parents still say that they would like her to marry John Paul and that he's an advantageous match. Poor Annabelle. I hope she gets out of that. We get Barbara's perspective all of a sudden. She's in a cabin in the woods, safe and clear. The night she left, she had to leave later than she planned because both her counselors went out and then they came back late. So she didn't get to TJ's cabin until around 3 a.m. So TJ knew Louise was lying both times. The two get into TJ's truck and enact a long-awaited plan. It is revealed that they stashed Barbara's bloody uniform from when she cut her thigh skinning the squirrel in John Paul's car. They're framing him in the same way that Carl Stoddard was probably framed by the McLelands. Echo. The whole time they're driving, TJ is quizzing Barbara about living in the wild. What do you do about water? Build a fire. Use iodine. The same instructions and questions and quizzing they've been going over all summer now. Certainly during their training sessions for survival trip, also during their training sessions at night, preparing Barbara to live on her own in the wilderness in TJ's cabin, just until she turns 18 and is able to make her own decisions so that she doesn't have to go to this disciplinary reform school. TJ was the one who always tended to Barbara, who helped her and taught her. And Barbara says that TJ and motherly are not two words that go hand in hand. TJ is the closest thing to a mother that she's ever known. So upon hearing that Barbara was about to be sent away to what is potentially a very abusive space, the two hatched a plan. They get out of the car and they dismount the canoe and they row across the lake. We're almost there. We're almost there. And TJ is taking an enormous risk here. Like, she probably knew she would be implicated. Eventually, TJ has to go back to the camp before the searching will begin. You'll be fine, says TJ. I'll be fine, says Barbara. Barbara walks into the cabin that the Hewitts built many generations ago. She opens the paper bag she brought from Self-Reliance and pulls out a picture of Bear. You're safe now, she tells her brother. Safe. Judy finds that she can't let the case go. Can't let the hunch that perhaps Barbara is out at that lake go. And so she drives and she hikes and she swims all the way to TJ's cabin. And Barbara emerges from behind a tree. And Judy says, "Are you all right?" "Yeah. Are you? Do you want me to leave you alone?" "Yes," Barbara says with finality. And Judy, despite the fact that knowing that finding Barbara Van Laar would be a career-winning case, would open doors for women in police work anywhere, everywhere, despite the fact she figured it out when no one else did, she says all right. She swims home and she tells no one, because that's what's best for Barbara. When she looks back to the island, she sees only the pines, drawn closed like a curtain around the girl. Does that, in fact, make Barbara the god of the woods? My name is Sage. Thanks so much for watching. Next time.